Welcome back to Background Historian. Tonight, we begin a quiet and reflective journey into one of the most often misunderstood chapters of European history. The Spanish Inquisition is usually remembered through sharp images and dramatic storytelling, but in this series we will soften the edges and move slowly, exploring it with a calm and balanced lens. We will drift through the world that gave rise to the Inquisition, the complex mix of religion, politics, fear and hope that shaped Spain during the late 15th century. We will meet the people who lived through it, from monarchs and clergy to merchants, travelers, and ordinary families trying to understand the changes happening around them. And we will take our time, unraveling each century and each shift in tone with gentleness and clarity, easing into the deep currents beneath the history rather than the noise above it. By the end of our 20 parts, you will have a peaceful but thorough understanding of how the Inquisition rose, how it functioned, how it changed through time, and how its legacy echoes into the modern day. Let your breathing slow, let the historical world settle around you, and when you are ready, we will begin with Part 1. Part 1. A quiet prelude, Spain before the Inquisition. Before the institution known as the Spanish Inquisition emerged, before its tribunals, its officials, its reputation and its mythologies, Spain was a land defined by a slow and sometimes uneasy blending of cultures. To understand how the Inquisition took root, one must first drift backward into the centuries that preceded it, where the Iberian Peninsula was not yet the unified kingdom people imagine today, but a mosaic of kingdoms, languages, customs, and faiths. This is where our story truly begins. And tonight, we step gently into that older world, approaching it with curiosity rather than urgency, with soft attention rather than sharp judgment. If you imagine the peninsula as a great and varied landscape stretching from the cool northern mountains to the warm Andalusian plains, you can almost picture the distinct rhythms that shaped each region. These rhythms were not only geographical but cultural, because for hundreds of years, Christian kingdoms in the north, Muslim caliphates in the south, and Jewish communities scattered throughout existed in varying degrees of coexistence and tension. This mixture, which historians sometimes refer to as convivencia, was neither a perfect harmony nor permanent peace, yet it created a society far more layered and diverse than the one that would later usher in the Inquisition. To fall into this early Spain is to understand that faith and identity were not simple categories. They were woven threads that people carried with pride, fear, or secrecy. In the Christian north, monasteries shaped intellectual life, and Gothic architecture rose slowly stone by stone. In the Muslim south, libraries overflowed with manuscripts, architects carved delicate arches into palaces like the Alhambra, and scientific knowledge flourished in ways that would influence Europe for centuries. Jewish scholars, poets, physicians, and merchants moved between these worlds, sometimes embraced, sometimes restricted, always adapting to the shifting politics of the peninsula. In these earlier centuries, tolerance was never absolute, but coexistence was real enough that multiple faiths interacted daily, through trade, through scholarship, and through the small practical realities of living side by side. This patchwork dynamic created a richness that future generations would look back upon with a sense of wonder. Yet beneath this surface, currents of mistrust often swelled, especially during times of famine, war, or plague. Unity could feel fragile, and leaders sometimes leaned on religious identity to strengthen political power. By the late 14th century, those tensions had grown heavier. Europe had endured the Black Death, which swept through cities and villages with a force that altered entire economies and fractured communities. When so many lives were lost in such a short time, fear became a constant companion. In many places across Europe, Jewish communities were scapegoated, even though they suffered just as terribly as their Christian neighbors. Violence erupted in some regions, expulsions in others. In Spain, forced conversions became increasingly common, not through law at first, but through mob pressure and political turmoil. This wave of conversions produced a new group of people in Spanish society, the conversos, Jews who had adopted Christianity, sometimes willingly, but often under coercion or threat. Conversos could rise to positions of influence in government, business, and academia, and some did so with remarkable success. They became part of the social fabric, but also targets of suspicion. Old prejudices did not disappear simply because religious identity seemed to have changed. Many Christians doubted the sincerity of conversion, whispering that conversos practiced Judaism in secret or maintained loyalty to their former communities. Whether those claims were true or simply the result of fear and envy depended on each situation, but the distrust would have long-lasting consequences. At the same time, Spain's Christian kingdoms, Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and others, were inching slowly toward consolidation. The long conflict known as the Reconquista, a process spanning centuries in which Christian forces reclaimed territory from Muslim rulers, had created an enduring framework of religious triumphalism. By the 15th century, Christian monarchs increasingly saw themselves not merely as rulers of territories but as guardians of a religious identity. And into this atmosphere entered two figures whose marriage would ultimately reshape the destiny of Spain, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. Ferdinand and Isabella, known as the Catholic monarchs, shared a singular vision for the future of Spain. That vision was bound to political stability, unity, and religious uniformity. Their world was one in which religion and governance were inseparable. A kingdom strengthened by one faith, one crown, one direction, that was their dream. And their marriage in 1469 became a turning point in Spanish history, uniting the two most powerful Christian realms on the peninsula. For the average person living under their rule, however, life still unfolded slowly and rhythmically. Farmers tended to fields as their parents and grandparents had. Traders traveled between towns, negotiating prices for wool, grain, and spices. Families sat by the light of oil lamps, discussing the news filtering through the countryside about battles, taxes, marriages, droughts, and festivals. Across Spain, life was full, complicated, and quietly beautiful. But beneath its peaceful surface, the currents of fear and change twisted and deepened. By the time Ferdinand and Isabella turned their attention toward religious issues, a sense of instability hung in the air. The conversion of Jews during earlier violence still haunted communities. The Muslim population in the south lived under increasingly restrictive conditions. Political factions struggled for influence. Rumors of clandestine practices swirled through towns. In such a climate, the monarchs believed, or perhaps convinced themselves, that unity required not only political alignment but spiritual alignment as well. And so, the seeds of the Spanish Inquisition were planted. Not suddenly, not explosively, but gradually, born from decades of fear, suspicion, and shifting identity. The institution would eventually rise with immense power, shaping law, culture, and social life for centuries. But before that moment arrives in our story, we must let this older Spain linger in our minds a little longer. Because it is within this world, this mixture of beauty and fragility, that the Inquisition found its fertile ground. As you settle further into relaxation, imagine the dim glow of lanterns in narrow medieval streets, the echo of church bells drifting across rooftops, the soft flutter of parchment in a quiet study. Picture the many families, of many backgrounds, who lived through these changes without knowing what history would make of their time. Imagine the gentle hum of marketplaces, the scent of bread rising from ovens, the murmur of prayers spoken in Latin, Hebrew, and Arabic. These lives formed the tapestry on which the next chapters of history would be woven. And so this is where the story begins, not with tribunals or punishments, but with a land full of contrasts, full of ideas, full of memories carried by three great religious traditions. A land shifting toward something new, pulled by leaders who believed unity required control, and by fears that whispered through crowded streets and quiet homes alike. Part 2. The rise of the Catholic monarchs and the first embers of conversion anxiety. As we drift deeper into the unfolding story of the Spanish Inquisition, Part 2 invites us to settle into a quieter space within late medieval Spain. Here, the landscape is changing, slowly but unmistakably. The Iberian Peninsula is still a mosaic of kingdoms, languages, and faiths, but a new kind of gravity has begun to pull these pieces toward a single center. That center is the union of Ferdinand and Isabella, whose reign would shape the course not only of Spanish history, but of European and religious history for centuries. If you allow your mind to wander back into this world, imagine the year as somewhere in the late 1470s. Picture a Castilian village nestled among rolling hills, its houses built of stone and wood, its narrow streets filled with the sound of footsteps on packed earth. You can almost hear the creak of wooden carts and the lowing of livestock. Daily life feels steady, familiar, and deeply local. But beyond the edges of this quiet scene, powerful shifts are taking place at the highest levels of society. Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, through their marriage, have created an alliance that is as much political as it is personal. Their courts bustle with advisors, diplomats, nobles, and clergy. They share a vision of a unified Christian kingdom, not fragmented by internal disputes, not weakened by competing noble families, and certainly not divided by religious difference. They see unity as strength, and strength as the means to bring order to a land that has known centuries of conflict between kingdoms both Christian and Muslim. As their reign begins, the Catholic monarchs confront an issue that has simmered in the peninsula for decades, the complicated presence of conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity, often under duress. These converts had entered Christian society, built careers, established families, and contributed to civic life. Some became respected officials, lawyers, physicians, scholars, or merchants. Others lived more quietly, blending into the daily routines of their neighbors. But their presence stirred suspicion in many corners of Spanish society. This suspicion did not arise suddenly. It grew slowly out of earlier waves of violence and forced conversions, especially the terrible riots of 1391, when Jewish communities were attacked in multiple cities. Many Jews converted in the aftermath, understanding that the alternative could be death or exile. These mass conversions produced a population whose recent ancestors had practiced Judaism openly, and whose descendants now lived as Christians, at least officially. But in the eyes of many old Christians, a phrase that referred to those whose Christian lineage stretched back generations, these new converts were never quite fully trusted. People whispered that some conversos secretly kept Jewish customs alive in their homes. They imagined hidden candles lit on Friday evenings, prayers spoken quietly in Hebrew, dietary restrictions observed in the shadows. Whether these suspicions were true in individual cases varied widely, but the rumors took on a power that surpassed evidence, becoming rumors that traveled from market stalls to courtrooms, from taverns to noble households. What made the situation particularly volatile was that many conversos rose to positions of influence. Their education, literacy, and urban experience made them valuable to the administration, to trade networks, and to the financial systems of the kingdom. but their success bred resentment among those who felt threatened by their advancement. Sometimes this resentment took the form of economic envy, other times it reflected deeper anxieties about Spain's identity. As the Catholic monarchs envisioned a unified, centralized kingdom, the very presence of a group perceived as the in-between, not fully Jewish, not fully Christian, was seen as a challenge to that ideal. Meanwhile, another layer of complexity was forming in the southern part of the peninsula, where Granada, the last Muslim-ruled kingdom, still remained independent. The centuries-long Reconquista was nearing its conclusion, and Ferdinand and Isabella were determined to bring all of Iberia under Christian rule. To them, this was not only a military goal but a spiritual one. They saw themselves as defenders of the faith, chosen to complete a process their ancestors had begun long before. This merging of political ambition and religious purpose created a climate in which any perceived impurity within the Christian faith felt threatening, not only to theological order, but to political stability. Conversos became the focus of that anxiety. Their very existence seemed to blur the neat boundaries that Ferdinand and Isabella wished to define. When you imagine the royal court during these years, picture a vast stone palace filled with flickering torchlight. Advisors debate policy. Bishops and theologians argue about doctrine and discipline. Noble families seek influence and fear losing it. And across the table from them all sit the monarchs, quietly absorbing everything, weighing each decision not only for its immediate consequence but for its broader role in shaping a unified Spain. As the 1470s progress, reports begin to reach the monarchs claiming that many conversos are secretly practicing Judaism. Some of these reports are sincere allegations from neighbors or priests, others are politically motivated, driven by local feuds, resentment, or fear. Still others are simple exaggerations or inventions. But Ferdinand and Isabella do not dismiss them. They see in these reports a potential threat to the spiritual and political unity they are trying to build. In their minds, a kingdom divided internally by insincere Christians. People who outwardly follow the faith but inwardly preserve a rival religion, could weaken the monarchy, undermine the church, and destabilize social order. The monarchs also fear that if Jewish practices are tolerated among conversos, the Jewish communities that still exist openly in Spain might encourage or influence them. Whether these fears were grounded in reality mattered less than the perception that the unity of the realm was vulnerable. By the end of the decade, a slow but decisive shift has occurred in the royal mindset. The question is no longer whether something must be done, but what should be done. Clergy and lay officials propose different solutions: tighter parish controls, increased surveillance, moral instruction, or legal restrictions. But none of these feel strong enough, definitive enough, or unifying enough for the monarch's grand vision. And so the earliest embers of what will become the Spanish Inquisition begin to glow, first as an idea, then as a murmured possibility, then as an option spoken aloud in council chambers. The notion of an ecclesiastical tribunal, a body empowered to investigate the sincerity of Christian practice, appeals strongly to the monarchs. It aligns with their desire to protect the soul of the kingdom, to strengthen its unity, and to assert their authority not only over the physical realm but the spiritual one. But for now, in this moment at the end of Part 2, the Inquisition is still only a seed, an idea waiting for a catalyst. The stage is set, the pressures have aligned, and the concerns of the monarchy have crystallized. All that remains is the decision that will transform these whispers into an institution. Let your thoughts settle here for a moment. Picture a kingdom balanced delicately between hope for unity and fear of division. Picture quiet households lit by the warm glow of lamps, where families navigate identity in ways that outsiders cannot see. Picture the monarchs gazing across maps of Spain, imagining a future shaped by order and devotion. The Inquisition has not yet begun, but every step taken so far has led directly toward its creation. Part 3. The birth of the tribunal, when whispers became law. As we drift deeper into this series, Part 3 brings us to one of the most defining and quietly pivotal moments in Spanish history, the official establishment of the Spanish Inquisition. To approach this moment gently, imagine yourself standing at the threshold of a great turning point, watching events unfold as though from a soft twilight distance. The year is 1478. Ferdinand and Isabella have ruled together for nearly a decade. Their marriage has unified Castile and Aragon in a way that earlier generations only dreamed of. Their ambitions are broader now than ever before. They want a Spain that is orderly, prosperous, and spiritually cohesive. They have navigated civil conflicts, noble rivalries, economic turmoil, and the lingering wars of the Reconquista. Through it all, they have held on to one guiding belief, that unity, spiritual, political, and cultural, is the path to a strong and enduring kingdom. But beneath the surface of their achievements lies a growing anxiety. Reports continue to reach the palace, rumors of conversos secretly observing Jewish practices, neighborhood disputes erupting into accusations, priests complaining of irregular confessions, and local officials observing moments of unexplainable religious inconsistency. Some cases are real, some imagined, and some maliciously fabricated, but together they create an atmosphere of uncertainty. To the monarchs, it feels as if the spiritual fabric of the kingdom is beginning to fray. In this environment, advisors propose solutions ranging from increased clerical oversight to stricter parish enforcement. But none of these seem sufficient. Ferdinand and Isabella want certainty, clarity, and discipline. They want a mechanism that is not piecemeal or regional, but national, a single unified system capable of ensuring the sincerity of all Christians in their realm. This desire leads them inevitably to the idea of the Inquisitio, an institution that already exists elsewhere in Europe under papal authority, tasked with investigating and correcting heresy. But Spain's monarchs envision something different. They imagine a tribunal that will be under their influence, functioning in close collaboration with the crown rather than operating independently. They want to use the weight of papal approval to create an inquisition that is not only religious but deeply tied to the project of national unity. And so in 1478, Ferdinand and Isabella send a formal request to Pope Sixtus IV. They ask for permission to appoint inquisitors who would operate within their kingdoms, with full ecclesiastical authority to investigate and judge cases of suspected heresy among conversos. They justify their request by describing the widespread concerns about insincere conversions and the potential danger such insincerity poses to Spain's spiritual health. This request does not come lightly. Monarchs rarely ask for a new institution that could bring controversy or resistance among their own people. But Ferdinand and Isabella are determined, convinced that the future of their realm depends on religious uniformity. Pope Sixtus IV reads their request carefully. He understands the tension surrounding converso populations, and he understands the monarch's concern. In his view, heresy is indeed a danger to the Church's unity. But he also knows that inquisitions in the past have been problematic, sometimes abused for local political gain. To grant the monarch's request means giving them enormous power over religious life. But the Pope also sees the value in strengthening ties with two rising monarchs whose influence is growing in Europe. And so, in November of 1478, he grants permission through a papal bull. With this document, the monarchs are authorized to appoint inquisitors who will operate with the Church's blessing but under royal selection. What is born at that moment is not yet the feared and expansive Spanish Inquisition that many imagine. It is a seed, quiet, small, and still theoretical. Yet seeds can grow quickly under the right conditions. At first, Ferdinand and Isabella take their time. They do not immediately appoint inquisitors. They want to observe the social climate to see whether the mere existence of papal approval will influence local behavior. For several years, they wait. Meanwhile, tensions around conversos continue to simmer. In cities like Seville, Toledo, and Córdoba, complaints rise from ordinary citizens, clergy, and nobles. Some claim to witness secret Jewish customs. Others complain of rising social competition from converso families who have achieved economic success. Some openly resent their social mobility. The pressure mounts slowly but steadily, like warm air gathering before a storm. Ferdinand and Isabella realize that inaction may be interpreted as weakness. And so in 1480, they take the decisive step. They appoint the first panel of inquisitors for the city of Seville. From this moment onward, everything changes. These first inquisitors are Dominican friars, men known for their strict adherence to doctrine and their commitment to spiritual discipline. They arrive in Seville with authority that is both religious and royal, carrying with them the sense that they are fulfilling a divinely sanctioned task. Imagine the mood in Seville when the news spreads. Picture the narrow, sun-warmed streets of the city, with its stone homes, open-air markets, and winding alleys. Conversations shift. Some people are fearful, especially among converso families who worry that their customs, however quietly practiced, will come under scrutiny. Others feel relief, believing that the arrival of inquisitors will finally bring order to a confusing and tense community dynamic. Still others are cautious, uncertain how this new tribunal will operate. When the inquisitors establish their headquarters, they bring with them not only religious authority but a detailed system of procedures. Formal examinations, witness testimonies, interrogations, and theological evaluations. Their power is wide-ranging, and their decisions are legally binding. The earliest trials begin almost immediately, focusing on prominent converso families accused of secretly maintaining Jewish rituals or rejecting Christian doctrine. Accusations come from neighbors, rivals, distant relatives, or sometimes from frightened individuals eager to deflect suspicion from themselves. The inquisitors sift through these accusations with procedures that are, in theory, methodical, though in practice deeply intimidating. The city enters a state of collective tension. People who once spoke freely now choose their words carefully. Families avoid public displays that might be misinterpreted. Rituals that once comforted communities now feel dangerous if they resemble anything Jewish in origin. The very definition of good Christian behavior becomes both stricter and more scrutinized. But the inquisitors see themselves as protectors of the faith, fulfilling the monarch's vision. They believe they are purifying Spain, strengthening it from within. They feel that each trial and confession, each penance or punishment, is part of a greater mission. As the first years of the Inquisition unfold, its presence spreads slowly from Seville to other cities. The monarchs, observing its effectiveness in consolidating religious conformity, extend its reach. What began as a response to local fear becomes a national institution. What began as a handful of inquisitors becomes an expanding network. Still, in these early days, the Inquisition is not yet the formidable force it will become. Its structure is still forming, its rules still evolving, and its authority still being established. But its foundation is solid, and its momentum is unmistakable. Let your mind settle here, observing this turning point from above. The Inquisition is no longer an idea. It is alive, operating, influencing behavior, reshaping identity. It has stepped into Spain's public consciousness, not with sudden violence but with quiet, persistent force. Part 4. The Spreading Flame: How the Inquisition Expanded Across Spain. As we ease into Part 4, imagine the landscape of Spain in the early 1480s. Picture it not as a map, but as a vast, quiet countryside at dusk. Hills rolling gently into distant valleys. Small towns perched on rocky outcrops. Olive groves twisting in the wind. The silhouettes of old churches rising above clusters of whitewashed homes. It is a world that feels peaceful from afar, but beneath that stillness, something new is beginning to unfold. The Spanish Inquisition, first rooted in Seville, has begun to grow. Not suddenly, and not explosively, but steadily, predictably. Like a flame catching on dry wood, spreading from one corner of the kingdom to the next. The monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, encouraged this expansion, believing deeply in the stability it will bring. Local officials, clergy, and nobility also play their roles, some eagerly, some reluctantly, some cautiously. To understand how the Inquisition spread, we must first understand how Spanish society was woven together. Spain was not a single uniform nation but a mosaic of regions. Castile, Aragon, Valencia, Catalonia, Navarre, each with its own culture, laws, and rhythms of life. What happened in one region did not automatically echo in another. But the Inquisition, because it was directly under royal guidance, had the rare ability to cross these borders and unify the kingdom under a single judicial structure. And so, after gaining its foothold in Seville, it was only a matter of time before it traveled outward. The early steps of expansion. The next major center to feel the presence of the tribunal was Córdoba. This ancient city, once the heart of Islamic Spain, held a diverse population of Christians, Jews, Muslims, and converts. Reports from Córdoba suggested increasing tension among its communities, with converso families finding themselves at the center of disputes and suspicions. When inquisitors arrived there, they encountered a different social structure than in Seville. Córdoba had a long intellectual and cultural tradition. Its residents were more accustomed to complex religious interactions, and more resistant to sudden intrusion. But the inquisitors came with royal authority, and they entered the city with a quiet determination. They established their offices, issued edicts of grace inviting people to confess voluntarily, and held public sermons encouraging repentance. From Córdoba, the Inquisition's influence moved to Toledo, one of the most vibrant and culturally mixed cities in all of Spain. Toledo was known as the city of three cultures, home to Christians, Jews, and Muslims who had lived in close proximity for centuries. It had been a place where scholars translated ancient texts, where craftsmen worked side by side, where religious festivals wove through the streets. But beneath the surface of Toledo's beauty were old resentments, political rivalries, and economic competition. Accusations, sometimes whispered, sometimes shouted, found fertile ground here. When the Inquisition arrived, it encountered a city emotionally charged, filled with both genuine fear and opportunistic hostility. Many conversos, especially those who had achieved wealth and success, became immediate targets. The expanding tribunals operated with careful structure. They did not simply appear and begin conducting trials. Instead, they followed a methodical process that had its own rhythm and phases. The Edict of Grace. In each new region, inquisitors issued what was known as the Edict of Grace. This was a formal announcement posted in town squares, read aloud in churches, and delivered through local messengers. the edict invited people to come forward voluntarily and confess any heretical behavior, whether their own or others, in exchange for lighter penances. On paper, this was meant to be a merciful gesture, offering forgiveness and reintegration into the Church. But in practice, it created an atmosphere of fear. People feared failing to confess something the tribunal might later uncover. People feared being named by others. People feared misremembering, underexplaining, or misunderstanding what counted as heresy. Imagine the feeling: you live in a small town where neighbors have known one another for decades. You shop at the same markets, attend the same feast days, share seasonal rhythms, harvests, weddings, funerals, baptisms. Then, suddenly, a poster appears calling you to confess your spiritual shortcomings. You begin to wonder whether your neighbors are watching you. Whether your customs, your speech, your celebrations, even the way you cross yourself or keep your home, could be misinterpreted. It is a fear that does not roar, but whispers. A fear that changes behavior silently. And across Spain, that fear began to spread. The social atmosphere, suspicion, silence, and survival. As the Inquisition expanded, a subtle transformation unfolded within communities. Old habits changed. Conversations transformed. Where people once told jokes, gossiped, or discussed family histories, they now measured their words carefully. A joke referencing Jewish customs might be misinterpreted. A story about a grandmother's old traditions might be considered dangerous. A dispute with a neighbor might lead to an accusation. People learned to keep their thoughts close and their concerns silent. Families who had once proudly displayed their heritage began hiding it. Some stopped using old family recipes. Others changed household rituals. Some burned objects that might be seen as suspicious: candlesticks, prayer shawls, family documents. It was not that they rejected their identity. It was that survival required caution. Children, too, became cautious. They were warned not to sing certain songs, not to mention family stories at school, not to mimic old customs they did not understand. In homes across Spain, parents instructed their children to blend in, to behave properly, to never stand out in matters of faith. The expansion of the Inquisition was less about public spectacle and more about this slow internal shift. The fear of accusation became its own form of discipline. The crown's growing confidence. As Ferdinand and Isabella watched the Inquisition spread, they saw results. Trials produced confessions. Confessions produced penances. Public autos DAFE demonstrated the tribunal's authority. Citizens began behaving more cautiously, more uniformly. This aligned perfectly with the monarchy's goal of creating a united Christian kingdom. The monarchs were especially pleased that the Inquisition strengthened their control over regions where local nobles or clergy were historically powerful. The new tribunal did not answer to local authority. It answered to the crown. In this way, it served simultaneously as a religious instrument and a political one. The Pope, observing from Rome, grew uneasy at how much control the monarchs exercised over the Inquisition. But by the time he voiced concerns, the system was already rooted deeply in Spain, and reversing it was nearly impossible. The Inquisition's institutional structure begins to solidify. As the 1480s progressed, the Inquisition evolved from a collection of regional tribunals into a more unified institution. The monarchy and the chief inquisitors began standardizing procedures. They developed official manuals to ensure consistency. They trained scribes and notaries. They established networks of local informants, priests, town officials, and sometimes even guild leaders, shepherds, merchants, or millers. Anyone could become a witness, and anyone could be accused. The tribunal's growing structure gave it strength and continuity. Even when inquisitors died, retired, or moved, the organization persisted. It became a self-sustaining body, driven by an organizational framework rather than by the personalities within it. And the people, watching all of this unfold, adapted. Some adapted through obedience. Some adapted through resistance. Some adapted through invisibility. And some, tragically, did not survive the new climate. But all of Spain felt the shift. The Inquisition was no longer an experiment. It was an expanding, evolving institution, spreading across regions like a slow-moving shadow. As we gently drift into Part 5, we will explore the lived experience of ordinary people during these early years, not only conversos, but also old Christians, clergy members, merchants, and rural families. We will look at how suspicion shaped communities, how daily routines changed, and how people navigated life under the watchful eye of the tribunal. A quiet journey into the everyday world of a nation learning to live under fear, faith, and authority. Part 5. Living under the tribunal, ordinary life in an age of quiet fear. As we begin Part 5, imagine settling into a warm and steady rhythm, like walking through a small Spanish town just after sunset. The sky is fading into deep indigo. Lamps glow in narrow windows. The air carries the smell of bread cooling on wooden tables and the faint trace of smoke rising from distant hearths. For a few hushed moments, life feels peaceful. Yet beneath the calm of these evenings in the late 15th century, something less visible moves through communities. A quiet caution. A gentle tightening of daily routines. An awareness that the world has changed. This part of our journey focuses not on monarchs, popes, or inquisitors, but on the people who lived under the early Spanish Inquisition. Their days, their fears, their hopes, their adaptations. In history, it is easy to talk about grand events and forget the individuals who lived through them. But in this series, we move slowly enough to see them, one household at a time. A morning in the life of an ordinary family. To understand the mood of these communities, imagine a small stone house with a tiled roof in a town outside Toledo. Before the Inquisition arrived, mornings in such a home felt predictable. A mother might wake before sunrise to knead dough. A father might prepare tools for the fields or arrange goods for the market. Children would stumble sleepily into the courtyard, brushing crumbs from their wool tunics. But after the Edict of Grace and the early arrests, a subtle shift begins to alter the rhythm of mornings. Conversations become shorter. Voices soften. Before opening the door for the day, a parent might glance outside, making sure no strangers linger nearby. Not because they expect danger, but because they do not want to be overheard saying something that might be misinterpreted. This is how the Inquisition's presence takes root. Not through constant confrontation, but through steady influence on daily thought. If a family is of old Christian ancestry, their concerns might revolve around reputation. They may worry about being falsely accused by a neighbor with whom they had a past argument. They may worry about appearing too curious about the tribunal. They may worry about being seen as sympathetic to converso families, even if their relationships were once friendly and uncomplicated. If a family has converso roots, their mourning begins with much deeper caution. They must monitor their gestures, their routines, and even their expressions. A mother might avoid certain recipes passed down by her grandmother. A father might restrain himself from mentioning an older relative's customs. Children might be warned never to repeat stories heard at home when visiting friends. The Inquisition does not stand outside every door. It does not march down every street. But its presence lives inside the mind. The atmosphere of the marketplace. Walk with me now into the town's marketplace, where stone arches frame stalls piled with fruits, grains, candles, salted fish, and pottery. Conversations once filled the air freely. Merchants teased regular customers. Neighbors compared harvests. Elders shared news about distant relatives. The arrival of the Inquisition does not silence the marketplace, but it changes its tone. People speak more quietly. Disagreements are settled politely, even when irritation simmers beneath the surface. The humor that once flowed between rival merchants is now subdued. No one wants to appear too familiar with someone under suspicion. No one wants to voice opinions that might be repeated elsewhere. Compliments become safer than criticisms. Questions become rarer. Gossip does not vanish, but it changes shape. Rather than idle storytelling, it becomes careful speculation about who might be called to testify, who might have confessed, or who might be holding back secrets. In this way, fear intertwines with curiosity. People want to know what is happening, yet they fear being overheard discussing it. They want clarity, yet they fear being seen searching for answers. The shadows of memory and heritage. For converso families, even the quiet act of remembering becomes complicated. Before the Inquisition's expansion, many conversos lived at peace with their past. Their grandparents may have practiced Judaism, but their parents were baptized, and they themselves grew up within the Christian church. Some still carried memories of Jewish customs, but these memories were soft, familial, and private. They belonged to the quiet corners of the home. Under the Inquisition, memory itself becomes risky. A grandmother lighting a candle on a Friday night, simply because it is comforting, may suddenly be seen as performing a forbidden ritual. A mother preparing a particular dish on a certain day of the year might worry that someone will smell it through the window. A father teaching his children a story he heard from his own parents might warn them immediately afterward not to repeat it to anyone outside the family. Heritage becomes a burden and a secret. Not because the people reject it, but because the climate makes even innocents vulnerable. The role of the parish priest. In many communities, the parish priest becomes a central figure in this new world. Priests hold the power to report suspicious behavior, intentionally or unintentionally. Some priests take on the role with caution, wanting to protect their flock rather than expose it. They encourage confession, prayer, and participation in the church, hoping these acts will shield their parishioners. Other priests, especially those aligned with strict reform movements, become more vigilant. They watch for signs of irregularity. They question families about their habits. They remind parishioners from the pulpit that God sees all and that the Inquisition is an instrument of divine justice. In rural villages, the priest might be the only person with close ties to the tribunal. His interpretation of events can shape the entire community's response. The quiet strain on friendships. Perhaps one of the most painful consequences of the early Inquisition is the way it strains friendships that once felt natural and easy. Old Christian neighbors may distance themselves from converso families, not out of hatred, but out of fear. They worry that being seen entering a converso home could invite suspicion. They worry that sharing meals or celebrations could become dangerous. Converso families feel this distance acutely. They know that their neighbor's caution is driven by self-preservation, but it still hurts. They may begin to avoid gatherings, even when welcome, out of fear of making others uncomfortable. In towns where communities were once tightly connected, invisible lines begin to form. Not firm lines. Not permanent lines. But lines created by anxiety. These are the changes that rarely make it into large historical narratives. Yet they form the emotional landscape of life during the early Inquisition. Children growing up under watchful eyes. Children, too, absorb the new atmosphere. They may not understand the details of the trials or the accusations, but they understand the tension in their homes. They sense the quiet urgency in whispered conversations. They feel the warnings embedded in parental instructions to be careful what they say. Some children become more silent, more cautious. Others become curious, asking questions that adults struggle to answer directly. In inquisitorial Spain, even childhood innocence becomes shaped by the constant encouragement to remain careful. The rhythm of religious life. The church becomes an anchor during these years. Mass attendance increases because it is seen as a sign of sincerity. People want to be observed participating. Confession becomes more frequent. Families attend feast days with more devotion. Households adopt new practices meant to highlight their commitment to Christian life. These acts are sometimes genuine, sometimes strategic, and often both. In times of fear, faith can grow deeper or become more publicly visible. It can also become more tightly controlled. The weight of silence. Across all these daily experiences, silence becomes a defining feature of life under the early Inquisition. Not an oppressive, heavy silence, but a persistent hum of caution. A silence that lives in pauses between words, in the breath held before a statement, in the decision to say nothing when once speaking felt natural. This silence becomes a way of surviving. A way of navigating a world where even unintentional gestures can be misunderstood. And yet, despite the tension, life continues. People marry. They farm. They trade goods. They celebrate births. They mourn losses. They teach children. They tell stories in private. They find moments of comfort, warmth, hope, and normalcy. Fear shapes behavior, but it does not erase humanity. This is the world of early inquisitorial Spain, a world suspended between ordinary life and extraordinary caution, between familiar routines and unfamiliar scrutiny. In Part 6, we will move deeper into the mechanics of the tribunal itself. We will examine how trials were conducted, how testimonies were gathered, and how inquisitors understood their work. This next part will continue our calm and careful journey through the inner chambers of the Inquisition. Part 6. Inside the tribunal, how investigations and trials quietly unfolded. As we continue our soft, nighttime journey through the history of the Spanish Inquisition, Part 6 invites us to step quietly into the heart of its machinery. Not into the stories of fear or rumor that filled the streets, but into the inner chambers where cases were weighed, testimonies recorded, and decisions slowly shaped. To keep the tone restful, imagine that we are entering not a harsh, echoing courtroom but a dim, stone-walled room lit by flickering candles, where dust drifts lazily in the warm evening air and the voices of officials rise only in low, measured tones. Trials under the Spanish Inquisition were not chaotic or hurried. They were deliberate, procedural, and often surprisingly bureaucratic. The tribunal operated more like an administrative engine than a dramatic stage. Its power lay not in sudden violence, but in quiet, methodical persistence. The inquisitorial process begins, a whisper becomes a case. Most inquisitorial cases began with something small, a whispered rumor, a comment overheard at a market, a strained relationship between neighbors, or the vague recollection of an unusual household custom. In other instances, they began with self-accusations, people approaching the tribunal voluntarily during the Edicts of Grace, confessing minor irregularities in hopes of shielding themselves from suspicion. Whenever the tribunal received information, no matter how slight, a notation was made. A scribe, trained to listen carefully and transcribe faithfully, recorded the details in a large register. These notes were not yet accusations, they were seeds, potential beginnings. The Inquisition did not accept anonymous denunciations lightly. Contrary to popular imagery, not every whispered rumor became a trial. Instead, the tribunal gathered overlapping pieces of information, looking for patterns. Only when multiple reports aligned, whether truthful or malicious, did the tribunal move to the next step, a formal investigation. But remember, even this stage unfolded slowly. Cases could linger for months, sometimes years, before anything happened. In the meantime, the accused often lived unaware that their name had ever been spoken inside the tribunal's quiet chambers. The summoning of witnesses. Once a case gained weight, inquisitors summoned witnesses. These were not dramatic court sessions, but private interviews conducted behind closed doors. Witnesses entered a room where an inquisitor sat with a scribe beside him. The inquisitor's tone was usually calm, sometimes pastoral, and often deceptively gentle. He was trained to appear fair, rational, and unemotional. Witnesses were encouraged to speak freely, to search their memories, to answer questions designed to probe deeply but quietly. The questions varied by case. Sometimes they were general. Do you know this family well? Are they faithful in attending Mass? Have you observed anything unusual in their home? Other times they were very specific. Did the accused light candles on a Friday evening? Did they refuse pork when invited to a meal? Were there whispers of Jewish customs practiced during mourning? Small moments of daily life, once harmless, once unnoticed, became points of scrutiny. Witnesses were not told who else had testified. They were not told whether the tribunal already had evidence. This secrecy added to the anxiety that hung over entire communities. People feared contradicting neighbors or saying too little. They feared revealing too much. They feared forgetting something important. The Inquisition relied heavily on these layers of testimony. The more voices that echoed the same concerns, the more confident the tribunal felt in moving forward. The secret dossier, building a case without public knowledge. One of the features that made the Inquisition so quietly powerful was its use of a secret dossier. As testimonies piled up, scribes compiled them into an organized file for each suspect. The accused, at this stage, still did not know they were under investigation. Life continued normally for them, meals shared with family, prayers whispered at church, conversations exchanged in the streets, while inside the tribunal, their fate was being shaped. This secrecy was intentional. Inquisitors believed that surprise prevented the accused from hiding evidence or coordinating false stories. But it also created a climate where the boundary between innocence and danger became blurred. The arrest, a quiet seizure. When the dossier reached sufficient weight, inquisitors decided whether to arrest the suspect. Arrests were not dramatic nighttime raids. More often, the accused was summoned to the tribunal under the pretext of clarifying a matter or answering routine questions. Only after entering the building would they learn they were being detained. Arrest did not necessarily mean guilt. many people were arrested simply to ensure that the investigation could proceed smoothly, without interference or flight. Once arrested, the accused was taken to a cell. In many cases, the conditions were stark but not cruel: stone walls, a wooden bench or cot, limited light. The Inquisition believed that harsh physical suffering produced unreliable confessions, so they usually relied instead on isolation, silence, and uncertainty. For a person taken from his or her home and cut off from the familiar, these psychological pressures could be profound. The reading of charges, a puzzling moment for the accused. After days or weeks of confinement, the accused was finally brought before inquisitors to hear the charges. This was often the first moment they realized what had been said about them. But inquisitors did not reveal names of witnesses. They did not provide detailed testimonies. Instead, they summarized the accusations in general terms. You are accused of following Jewish practices. You are accused of rejecting key teachings of the Church. You are accused of influencing others with heretical beliefs. The vagueness was deliberate. It forced the accused to search inward, to guess what others might have said, to fear their own memories, and, in many cases, to confess things that the tribunal had never known. The interrogation, calm, methodical, and unrelenting. Interrogations under the Inquisition were not scenes of shouting or fury. They were typically calm, controlled conversations. The inquisitors asked questions in low tones, repeating them, rephrasing them, circling around the same points. The psychological effect was profound. The accused sat before men in robes, educated, authoritative, and unwavering. Candles flickered. The scratching of the scribe's quill echoed in the stillness. Each answer felt heavy, recorded, judged. Day after day, the accused might be brought back for more questioning. Inquisitors believed that truth was revealed through persistence and consistency. A person who changed details or hesitated could appear deceitful. A person who repeated the same story unwaveringly might be hiding something. Some accused individuals confessed outright, hoping for mercy. Others tried to defend themselves, struggling to understand what the tribunal wanted. Some fell into despair, exhausted by the uncertainty. The role of torture, rare, regulated, and used as a last resort. While torture is often associated with the Inquisition, it was used far less frequently than many imagine. Strict rules limited when and how it could be applied. It was never meant to punish but to extract clarity when evidence was strong yet incomplete. In many cases, the mere threat of torture produced the desired effect. The knowledge that one might be taken to a chamber beneath the tribunal created overwhelming psychological pressure. But for most cases, the Inquisition relied on steady questioning, secret testimonies, and the gradual erosion of the accused's confidence. The verdict, penance, reconciliation, or severe punishment. Once the tribunal felt the case was complete, inquisitors reviewed the dossier in a private meeting. They read through testimony, confessions, contradictions, and behavioral patterns. Verdicts ranged widely. Many were given penances, prayers, pilgrimages, fines, or the wearing of a special garment called the sanbenito. Others were sentenced to imprisonment, sometimes temporary, sometimes lifelong. A much smaller number faced harsh punishments, including execution, typically by the civil authorities after the tribunal pronounced them relapsed or obstinate. The vast majority of cases did not end with death. Instead, they ended with reintegration into the Church. Though often with lasting stigma. The emotional landscape within the tribunal. Inside these quiet chambers, the inquisitors believed deeply in their mission. They saw themselves not as judges seeking to destroy lives, but as shepherds guiding souls back to orthodoxy. They viewed heresy as a spiritual illness and themselves as physicians of the faith. But from the perspective of the accused and their families, the tribunal was an imposing and unpredictable force. Its secrecy, its patience, and its authority created an atmosphere where ordinary people could easily feel exposed, vulnerable, and misunderstood. As we drift toward the next chapter, Part 6 brings us into the inner workings of the tribunal, but in Part 7, we will step back out into Spanish society to explore how communities responded to these unfolding trials. We will see how fear shaped relationships, how rumor filled the spaces between silence, and how the Inquisition became woven into the cultural identity of Spain. Part 7. The social ripples, how communities adjusted, adapted, and endured. As we begin Part 7, imagine yourself walking through a quiet Spanish village in the late 15th century. The sun is setting, casting soft hues of gold and violet across the tiled rooftops. Smoke curls upward from chimneys. Children are being called inside for supper. Dogs bark lazily in the distance. Everything looks peaceful. And yet, just beneath the familiar rhythm of life, something has shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. This part of our journey is about that shift. About how ordinary communities across Spain adjusted to the presence of the Inquisition. Not only the accused or their accusers, but everyone, farmers, merchants, priests, widows, artisans, travelers, and children, felt the effects of a tribunal that reached into the private corners of daily life. A new social vocabulary. One of the first and most subtle changes brought by the Inquisition was the transformation of everyday conversations. Words that were once harmless took on new layers of meaning. Phrases that once passed casually between neighbors now carried weight. People began speaking in what might be called a new social vocabulary, one shaped by caution. Neighbors greeted one another warmly, but cautiously. Laughter still filled gatherings, but it was quieter, shaped by awareness of who was listening. Even simple statements about faith, customs, or personal habits were delivered with care. People avoided expressing strong opinions about matters of religion, even if those opinions were entirely orthodox. They feared being misunderstood, or worse, reported. A person might hesitate before mentioning an unusual dream, a family recipe, or an old story told by a grandparent. In a world where inquisitors could interpret gestures, habits, or traditions as evidence of hidden beliefs, self-expression became a delicate matter. Friendships reshaped by fear. Before the Inquisition spread, friendships between old Christians and conversos were common in many cities. They traded goods, shared meals, attended weddings together, stood side by side during festivals, and sometimes even intermarried. Social bonds were woven through years of familiarity. But under the pressure of inquisitorial suspicion, these bonds strained, frayed, and sometimes broke. Old Christian families often felt caught in a painful tension. On one hand, they did not want to abandon long-time friendships. On the other, they feared that too much familiarity with conversos could draw unwanted attention. Being seen visiting a converso home, sharing a meal with them, or defending them publicly could be interpreted as sympathy for heresy. And so many friendships began to cool. Not always loudly. Often quietly. A neighbor making fewer visits. A family declining an invitation with polite excuses. A merchant recommending another supplier instead of his old converso partner. A child instructed gently not to play with certain friends as often. From the converso perspective, this shift was deeply painful. They felt the change in tone, the slight withdrawal, the coolness that replaced warm familiarity. Some adjusted by withdrawing as well, limiting their social world to trusted relatives. Others attempted to maintain relationships, offering reassurances or emphasizing their devotion to Christian practices. Many lived in a constant effort to appear beyond reproach. Communities did not break apart instantly. But they grew quieter, more reserved, more cautious. Gossip as a tool of survival and suspicion. Gossip existed long before the Inquisition, but it took on a new dimension during these years. It became both a weapon and a shield. For some, gossip was a way to divert suspicion. If the community was talking about someone else, they themselves were momentarily safe. Rumors about a family's strange habits, dietary choices, or relatives abroad could spread quickly, even if rooted in trivial or misunderstood observations. Others used gossip defensively. By repeating what they heard without giving personal opinions, they signaled compliance. Agreeing with the majority sentiment, even while feeling privately uneasy, became a social survival strategy. And then there were those who resisted gossip altogether, maintaining a dignified silence. But in an atmosphere where silence could be seen as suspicious, even restraint carried risk. This delicate balance created a social landscape where discernment became difficult, where truth was often overshadowed by fear, and where private tensions gained public consequence. Religious festivals and public worship take on new meaning. Religious festivals, once joyous gatherings marking feast days, saint celebrations, and seasonal rituals, began to carry a new layer of social importance. Attendance became not only an expression of faith, but a visible demonstration of orthodoxy. Families made a point to attend Mass more regularly. They participated in processions with greater enthusiasm. They made sure their children were present and visibly attentive. Gifts to the church increased. Confessions became more frequent. These acts were often genuine. Many Spaniards were deeply devoted to their faith. But they also carried a protective intention. Visibility in religious life offered a sense of security, a way to signal adherence to Christian norms. For converso families, participation in public worship took on particular urgency. A missed Mass, a late arrival, or a perceived lack of enthusiasm could fuel suspicion. Even the way one made the sign of the cross or approached communion could be watched. The Inquisition, in this way, subtly transformed the relationship between public piety and private fear. The role of local clergy and the shifting tone of sermons. Clergy members found themselves in a complex position. Parish priests often knew their congregants personally. They had baptized their children, blessed their marriages, and comforted them in times of loss. They understood the nuances of villagers' lives more intimately than distant inquisitors ever could. Some priests attempted to shield their parishioners from unnecessary scrutiny, offering pastoral advice on how to avoid misunderstandings. They encouraged devotion, regular confession, and caution in speech. Their sermons emphasized repentance but also compassion. Other priests, particularly those aligned with reformist movements, saw the Inquisition as a necessary tool for spiritual purification. Their sermons highlighted the dangers of hidden heresy, urging vigilance. They encouraged congregants to observe one another's behavior and report concerns. In communities with such priests, tension soared, as every family felt scrutinized. The tone of religious teaching shifted from hopeful to watchful. The parish became not only a center of worship but a subtle stage for evaluating sincerity. The emotional toll of uncertainty. Perhaps the most challenging aspect of living under the Inquisition was the omnipresent uncertainty. People did not know what actions could trigger suspicion. They did not know who was under investigation or whether their own names appeared in secret dossiers. They did not know which customs were considered harmless and which might be misinterpreted as heretical. This uncertainty created a low, persistent anxiety that shaped sleep, relationships, decisions, and inner peace. For conversos, the anxiety was heavier still. Even those fully committed to Christian doctrine and practice could not predict how others perceived them. Their sincerity might not protect them from accusations rooted in envy, old grudges, or misunderstandings. Communal efforts at maintaining harmony. Yet despite these tensions, many communities found ways to preserve social harmony. People continued to share resources during hard winters, help neighbors rebuild after storms, and celebrate weddings with music and laughter. Human bonds proved resilient, even under pressure. Some old Christian families privately reassured their converso neighbors that they would not betray them. Some converso families chose godparents for their children from respected old Christian households, creating protective alliances. In moments of grief or sickness, communities still came together, forgetting the invisible lines drawn by fear. These gestures show the depth of humanity that persisted even in difficult times. The Inquisition altered social dynamics, but it could not extinguish the fundamental bonds that connected people. Looking ahead to Part 8. In Part 8, we will move from the social sphere to the institutional one, exploring the creation of the Consejo Supremo de la Inquisition, the Supreme Council that transformed the tribunal into a powerful, centralized national institution. Through this lens, we will see how the Inquisition solidified its authority, standardized its processes, and expanded its reach across the entire Iberian Peninsula. Part 8. The Supreme Council, how the Inquisition became a unified national power. Part 8 invites us into a quieter, more administrative corner of history, where the Spanish Inquisition, once a scattered set of local tribunals, slowly transformed into a powerful national institution. It is a shift not marked by dramatic events or sudden violence, but by paperwork, correspondence, appointments, and the careful tightening of structure. As always, we approach gently, imagining not a chaotic bureaucracy but a calm, candlelit chamber where men in robes pore over documents with soft concentration. By the mid-1480s, the Inquisition had already taken root in several major cities, Seville, Córdoba, and Toledo among them. Tribunals were expanding, trials were increasing, and the monarchy was satisfied with the growing appearance of religious unity. Yet Ferdinand and Isabella recognized that uncontrolled expansion could lead to disorder. Different tribunals might adopt different standards. Inquisitors might interpret laws in slightly different ways, creating inconsistencies. And most significantly, local nobles and bishops might attempt to influence or manipulate inquisitorial decisions. To avoid such problems, the monarchs took a decisive step: they centralized the Inquisition. The birth of the Consejo Supremo. In 1483, Ferdinand and Isabella appointed a man whose name would become inseparable from the Inquisition's early identity, Tomás de Torquemada. A Dominican friar known for his strict piety, rigid discipline, and unwavering theological convictions, Torquemada impressed the monarchs with his organizational ability. They chose him to lead the newly formed Consejo Supremo de la Inquisition, commonly called the Suprema. The Suprema was not a single building or courtroom. It was an institution. A governing council responsible for overseeing every tribunal across Spain. From this point on, local inquisitions no longer acted independently. They reported upward, their decisions monitored, their procedures standardized, their actions reviewed. Imagine the Suprema as a slow but steady pulse at the center of a vast body. Each tribunal was like a limb or organ, doing its work in cities and towns. But the Suprema was the heart, sending out directives, receiving reports, and ensuring that the entire system functioned as a unified whole. Who sat on the Suprema? The council was composed primarily of seasoned churchmen, men trained in theology, canon law, and administrative discipline. Although the Pope formally approved the Inquisitor General, the council operated largely under royal direction. This created a unique relationship. The institution had ecclesiastical authority but functioned with royal oversight, blending spiritual and political power. The Suprema included the Inquisitor General, the highest authority, legal advisors, specialists in canon and civil law, theologians, experts in doctrine, secretaries and notaries, responsible for correspondence and record-keeping, royal liaisons, ensuring that the crown's interests were upheld. Torquemada presided over this council with unyielding discipline. His administrative mind worked tirelessly to create a system with no gaps, no inconsistencies, and no room for hesitation. Standardization of procedures. One of the Suprema's most influential roles was the creation of standardized procedures. Before its formation, different tribunals approached cases in slightly different ways. Some focused heavily on local customs. Others interpreted canon law with more leniency. Some preferred certain forms of interrogation. Others emphasized public penance. Torquemada changed this. Under his direction, detailed manuals were written. These manuals described how investigations should begin, how witnesses should be questioned, how accusations should be interpreted, how confessions should be handled, what types of evidence were acceptable, how verdicts should be reached, which punishments were appropriate for which offenses. The result was a uniform approach across Spain. Whether someone was tried in Seville or Zaragoza, the structure and language of their trial would feel remarkably similar. This consistency increased the Inquisition's authority. People began to understand that the tribunal was not a patchwork of local offices, but a national force with a single heartbeat. Communication across the kingdom. The Suprema relied on a vast system of communication. Couriers traveled between cities carrying sealed letters with instructions, updates, and requests for clarification. Monthly summaries of cases, confessions, and verdicts were sent to the council. The Suprema reviewed them, issued corrections, and sometimes ordered tribunals to reopen or reconsider cases. This communication formed the backbone of inquisitorial governance. It ensured that no tribunal drifted too far from doctrine, that no inquisitor wielded power without oversight, and that the system remained aligned with the monarchy's objectives. Financial administration. Another essential role of the Suprema was financial oversight. Tribunals required funds to operate, money for salaries, notaries, scribes, building maintenance, transportation, and imprisonment. The Suprema allocated budgets to each tribunal and monitored spending. The Inquisition also generated income through fines, confiscations, and fees associated with trials. These funds flowed into the administrative structure and helped sustain the institution. Torquemada ensured meticulous record-keeping, instructing tribunals to document every coin spent or collected. This heightened the Crown's confidence in the Inquisition and reinforced its position as a state-supported body. balancing religious and political objectives. The Suprema operated at the intersection of faith and governance. Its judges believed deeply in their religious mission, protecting the souls of Spain's Christians. But the monarchy viewed the Inquisition through an additional lens: stability, unity, and control. This dual purpose made the institution remarkably powerful. While the Church had doctrinal authority, the Crown had political objectives. The Suprema lived in the space between them, navigating both realms. For inquisitors, this meant that they were not merely protecting orthodoxy, they were shaping Spain's national identity. They were guardians of a vision in which religious uniformity was the foundation of political strength. The growing reach of the tribunal. With its central organization established, the Inquisition began expanding into new territories. Tribunals were set up in Jaén, Ciudad Real, Valladolid, Zaragoza, Barcelona, Valencia. Each new tribunal represented an extension of the Suprema's influence, a new node in the vast network of inquisitorial authority. The institution grew not like a wildfire but like a carefully cultivated vine, extending tendrils across the Iberian Peninsula with deliberate precision. Where the Inquisition arrived, social behavior changed. Clergy adjusted their sermons. Noble families evaluated their alliances. Merchants reconsidered business partnerships. Converso communities braced themselves for increased scrutiny. The Suprema integrated these social changes into its reports, creating a feedback loop between the tribunal and Spanish society. The more communities shifted, the more the Inquisition adapted. The Inquisitor General's expanding authority. Torquemada's leadership shaped the Inquisition profoundly. He believed in consistency, discipline, and unwavering orthodoxy. Under him, the Inquisition merged its spiritual mission with administrative efficiency. He reviewed cases personally, sometimes traveling to major tribunals to oversee proceedings. His presence intimidated some, reassured others, and always reinforced the system's unity. Torquemada's personal austerity, his simple lifestyle, strict habits, and ascetic devotion increased his authority. Whether loved or feared, he was undeniably respected within the structure he helped create. A new climate across Spain. By the late 1480s, the Inquisition had evolved from a collection of regional responses to converso anxiety into a nationally organized institution with a clear identity and broad reach. The Suprema's creation transformed everything. Fear became more evenly distributed across the kingdom. Procedures became predictable, even if intimidating. Clergy received consistent guidance. Nobles lost influence over religious matters. The crown gained unprecedented centralized power. Converso communities experienced intense scrutiny regardless of region. Spain was being reshaped, not by conquest or rebellion, but by administration. Looking ahead, we now stand at the threshold of the Inquisition's most influential decades. In Part 9, we will examine how the tribunal became not only a religious authority but a cultural force. We will explore how its presence influenced art, literature, architecture, and public rituals. And we will see how the Inquisition grew from an institution into a symbol, shaping Spain's identity for generations. Part 9. A culture transformed, the Inquisition's influence on art, ritual, and public life. As we begin Part 9, settle into a quiet, calm state of mind. Picture Spain at the turn of the 16th century not as a nation defined by fear alone, but as a place of vibrant cities, ancient cathedrals, lively marketplaces, and wide open plains touched by centuries of tradition. Imagine cobblestone streets lit by lanterns, musicians practicing in echoing courtyards, artisans carving designs into wood or metal, and families gathering around tables to share evening meals. Within this rich tapestry of daily life, the Spanish Inquisition, now a fully organized, centrally governed institution, began shaping not only religious practice and legal procedure, but also the very culture of Spain. Its influence seeped into art, public rituals, architecture, folklore, and even the rhythm of towns and cities. This part of our story explores how a tribunal designed to protect orthodoxy quietly reshaped a nation's imagination. An atmosphere felt in stone and sound. To understand the cultural influence of the Inquisition, imagine walking through the plaza of a major Spanish city, perhaps Toledo, Valencia, or Valladolid, in the late afternoon. The sun is low, casting warm amber light across stone buildings. You can hear the clatter of horse hooves on the street, the calls of merchants closing their stalls, and the distant toll of church bells. Although nothing dramatic is happening at this moment, the architecture around you tells a story. Look at the cathedral, towering, elaborate, filled with symbols of the church's immense authority. Look at the nearby tribunal building. Fortified, austere, unadorned, projecting a sense of discipline and vigilance. Together, these two structures, one dedicated to worship, the other to enforcement, create a visual dialogue across the city center. The Inquisition did not build many flamboyant structures. Its buildings were often practical, modest, and functional. But their presence changed how cities felt. People walking past these buildings were reminded daily of the tribunal's existence. Even when no trials were underway, the buildings themselves whispered of authority. Public ritual, autos dafe as cultural theater. Among the most visible cultural expressions of the Inquisition were the autos dafe, public ceremonies in which the results of trials were announced. While often associated with harsh punishments in later centuries, in the early decades the autos dafe were primarily ritualistic events combining confession, penance, and public reaffirmation of faith. These ceremonies became deeply woven into the cultural life of cities. Imagine a large plaza filled with people. Wooden platforms have been constructed. Officials in black robes stand beside clergy dressed in solemn liturgical garments. Citizens gather respectfully, though many also attend out of curiosity. This is not an ordinary day, it is a communal event drawing together all levels of society. For many Spaniards, attending an auto da fe was not an act of cruelty or bloodlust. It was a moral reminder, a call to unity, a reaffirmation of Christian devotion. The ceremony ended with hymns and processions, reinforcing the idea that the community, together, was participating in a spiritual cleansing. Over time, these rituals became part of civic culture, something expected, something familiar. They shaped the way communities understood justice, repentance, and social order. Art and the inquisitorial aesthetic. The influence of the Inquisition also spread more subtly through art. Painters and sculptors in Spain were not commissioned directly by the tribunal, but the cultural atmosphere shaped their work. Several trends emerged. 1. Religious intensity. Art leaned heavily towards scenes of martyrdom, saints resisting temptation, Christ's sacrifice, and the triumph of orthodoxy. These themes echoed the Inquisition's emphasis on spiritual purity. 2. Symbolic vigilance. Certain motifs, eyes, flames, chains, broken idols, began appearing in artwork, hinting at ideas of surveillance, purification, or the defeat of heresy. 3. Portraits of authority. Some painters created portraits of inquisitors or clergy, often depicted with stern, controlled expressions. These images projected an ideal of solemn duty rather than personal ambition. Yet Spanish art did not become rigid or lifeless. Paradoxically, the intense religious environment also produced a flowering of creativity. Artists like Bartolomé Bermejo, Pedro Berruguete, and later El Greco created masterpieces filled with emotional depth and luminous detail. The atmosphere of scrutiny made many artists more introspective, leading to works of profound spirituality. The sanbenito, a garment that shaped the imagination. One of the most culturally impactful symbols of the Inquisition was the sanbenito, a penitential garment worn by individuals who had confessed or been found guilty of heresy. These garments varied in design, but they often bore crosses, symbols of penance, or inscriptions naming the offense. Sanbenitos were displayed publicly in churches long after the penance ended, serving as a lasting reminder of the individual's past transgression. While traumatic for the individuals involved, the presence of sanbenitos also became part of the visual memory of Spanish society. Children growing up in towns with these garments displayed on church walls absorbed the idea that the community watched, remembered, and valued orthodoxy deeply. This had a powerful cultural effect. It shaped how people understood identity, belonging, and reputation. It encouraged conformity not through immediate coercion, but through long-term social pressure. Music and storytelling reflect the new order. Music in Spain, particularly religious hymns, chants, and processional songs, shifted in tone during these years. Composers emphasized themes of redemption, repentance, and divine authority. Communities learned these songs by heart. They were sung during festivals, funerals, baptisms, and holy days. Over time, the soundscape of Spain changed. The stories people told also evolved. Folk tales incorporated cautionary themes, stories of hidden heretics, divine warnings, miraculous conversions, or saints protecting the faithful from deception. Even harmless tales sometimes shifted subtly to reinforce moral lessons aligned with inquisitorial values. Children learned these stories at bedtime. Travelers shared them at inns. Storytellers wove them into market performances. In this way, the culture absorbed and transmitted ideas that aligned with the tribunal's worldview. Cultural conformity and social performance. One of the most profound cultural effects of the Inquisition was the emergence of social performance. The practice of carefully demonstrating one's faith. People became attentive to how their actions were perceived, how they crossed themselves, how often they attended Mass, how they observed holy days, how they participated in religious rituals, how they spoke about doctrine. This performative layer did not necessarily erase authentic devotion. Many Spaniards genuinely deepened their religious lives. But it added a new dimension to cultural expression. Spirituality became a public act as much as a private one. Literary reflections. Writers in this period, whether poets, scholars, or chroniclers, grappled with themes of purity, redemption, identity, and authority. Their works, sometimes cautious and coded, hinted at a society negotiating the boundaries between individuality and conformity. Some writers praised the Inquisition as a guardian of unity. Others expressed unease through allegory or indirect critique, aware that open dissent could bring danger. These subtle tensions enriched Spanish literature, giving it layers of meaning that mirrored the complexity of the society itself. The Inquisition as a cultural symbol. By the end of the 1400s, the Inquisition had become a powerful symbol in Spain, one that extended beyond its actual courtroom proceedings. It represented order, orthodoxy, continuity, discipline, the unity of church and crown, the triumph of Christian Spain. Even those who feared it recognized its cultural presence. It defined how communities understood moral boundaries. It shaped the imagination of cities and villages alike. Looking ahead to Part 10. In Part 10, we will explore the Inquisition's expansion beyond its original focus on conversos. As Spain changed, politically, religiously, and economically, the tribunal adapted to new concerns, including the growing influence of humanist thinkers, foreign travelers, books, and ideas from beyond Europe. This next part will follow the Inquisition into a broader landscape of cultural and intellectual scrutiny. Part 10. New frontiers of scrutiny, books, travelers, humanists, and the expanding reach of the tribunal. As you ease into Part 10, allow yourself to settle gently into a quiet mental space. Imagine the late 15th and early 16th centuries as a soft dusk settling over Europe. The world is on the brink of extraordinary change. Ships leave Iberian ports and cross oceans no European has seen before. Merchants return with goods from distant kingdoms. Ideas travel alongside sailors, scholars, and diplomats. A subtle shift begins to ripple through Spain's cultural landscape. People are exposed to new thoughts, new customs, new languages. In this shifting world, the Spanish Inquisition faces a challenge it had never anticipated during its earliest years, the challenge of ideas. No longer focused solely on conversos, the tribunal begins watching the circulation of books, the arrival of foreign travelers, the rise of humanist scholars, and the growing tension between faith and the expanding horizons of knowledge. As the world grows larger, the Inquisition's vigilance grows with it. Part 10 explores this turning point. The world opens, and with it, new anxieties. Picture Spain at the dawn of the 1500s. The medieval world is giving way to something new. The printing press spreads information faster than anything before it. Universities in Italy and France produce scholars fluent in Greek and Latin, rediscovering classical texts that had been dormant for centuries. Merchant ships bring not only spices and fabrics, but news, stories of foreign customs, unfamiliar religions, strange scientific claims. Spain is no isolated kingdom. It is becoming a global power. But with global influence comes global uncertainty. Spanish rulers, determined to maintain unity at home, fear that these winds of change might weaken the moral foundations of their kingdom. To them, the Inquisition is not merely a judicial body. It becomes a guardian standing at the gates of Spain's cultural landscape, watching everything that enters and everything that circulates. And so a new era begins. Humanism arrives in Spain. Humanism, a movement that emphasizes classical learning, rational inquiry, and the value of individual intellect, begins flourishing in Europe. Spanish scholars such as Juan Luis Vives, Antonio de Nebrija, and the brilliant Erasmus-influenced thinkers draw from Greek philosophy, Roman ethics, and an admiration for clarity in ancient languages. They are not heretics. They are faithful Christians seeking understanding. But humanism encourages questions. Gentle questions, quiet questions, questions prompted by reason rather than strict tradition. It encourages study of original texts rather than inherited commentary. It asks scholars to read, compare, translate, and analyze. And the Inquisition watches. Not because it hates learning, but because the line between scholarship and doctrinal deviation can be thin. For every careful humanist like Vives, there are thinkers in Europe who push too far. Reform movements are already simmering in Germany. Theologians debate the nature of grace, free will, the authority of the Church. Spain fears that the same controversies might take root within its borders. So Spanish humanists proceed cautiously, softening their language, clarifying their intentions, making sure their work aligns with accepted doctrine. Some are embraced. Others are quietly investigated. A few are forced into exile. The atmosphere is not hostile, but it is watchful. And that watchfulness shapes Spanish intellectual culture for generations. Books come under scrutiny. Before the printing press, controlling information was not terribly difficult. Books were expensive, rare, and mostly handwritten copies stored in monasteries or universities. But by the early 1500s, printing presses operate in major Spanish cities. Booksellers import works from France, Italy, and even the German states. Sailors bring manuscripts from distant lands. Scholars mail annotated copies to one another. Merchants distribute pamphlets and political tracts. Suddenly, ideas spread at a speed that feels almost dangerous. The Inquisition responds by developing a system of book review, an early form of literary regulation. Certain books are carefully examined for doctrinal errors. Others are restricted, permitted only to scholars with special approval. Still others are banned entirely. Yet even here, the intention is not cruelty, it is caution. The tribunal believes it is protecting the population, not oppressing it. To inquisitors, reading the wrong book is not like reading the wrong story, it is a door that might lead a soul astray. So watch lists are created. Printing houses are supervised. Booksellers are questioned. Libraries must maintain approved inventories. And slowly, the very act of reading becomes tinged with a sense of responsibility, seriousness, and moral weight. Spain develops a culture where books are treated with reverence. Reading becomes an intimate act, intentional and circumscribed. The arrival of foreign travelers. Another change occurs as Spain becomes a maritime empire. Foreigners begin arriving, merchants, diplomats, scholars, sailors, Jewish refugees from other kingdoms, and occasionally wandering mystics or prophets seeking audiences with the powerful. Each traveler brings not only goods but stories. Some speak of lands untouched by Christianity. Others bring texts unknown in Europe. Some practice faiths that Spaniards have never encountered. Spain, proud of its unity and wary of external influence, sees the Inquisition as the filter through which this influx must pass. Travelers who seek long-term residence may be questioned. Those rumored to engage in teaching or preaching may be monitored. Scholars visiting universities could be asked about their academic affiliations. Merchants might need to answer inquiries about the books or artifacts they carry. Again, the tribunal's goal is not to isolate Spain but to protect it from doctrinal drift. In an age when kingdoms rose and fell through marriages, alliances, trade agreements, and ideological movements, the monarchy sees intellectual stability as a form of national defense. And the Inquisition becomes part of that defense. The tribunal and the changing rhythm of public life. By this point in the story, the Inquisition is not merely an institution, it is a cultural presence woven into everyday existence. Its stories, trials, and rituals influence the rhythms of public life. Imagine a Spanish marketplace during this period. A bookseller arranges his stall, careful to display approved works prominently. A group of students gather around a traveling lecturer, curious but cautious. Priests engage in animated but careful debate. Families discuss news from other regions, always mindful of how they interpret events. The tribunal is not everywhere, yet its presence is felt everywhere. Even in towns where few or no trials occur, people speak of the Inquisition with a mix of respect, anxiety, and familiarity. It becomes a symbol of shared identity, a constant reminder that Spain is united not only by monarchy and land, but by a collective sense of spiritual purpose. Science and the Inquisition, a complex relationship. As new knowledge spreads, astronomy from Italy, medicine from the Islamic world, mathematics from Jewish scholars, exploration data from the New World, the Inquisition faces yet another challenge: how to regulate discoveries without undermining Spain's growing scientific ambitions. Contrary to modern misconceptions, the Spanish Inquisition is not uniformly opposed to science. Many inquisitors are educated scholars. Some studies are encouraged, particularly those seen as useful for navigation, agriculture, or medicine. But any theory that touches on theology must be scrutinized. For example, the nature of the universe, the interpretation of creation, philosophical claims about the soul, ethical debates about indigenous peoples. These topics become delicate terrain. Scientists tread carefully. Some publish widely. Others circulate their ideas in private circles. A few have their works reviewed by the tribunal before publication. Spain does not reject science, it simply insists that science respects certain boundaries. This shapes the Spanish intellectual tradition into something unique, contemplative, precise, deeply spiritual, and cautious of speculation. Spain's identity solidifies around faith. As the world grows more chaotic, reformations in Germany, wars in Italy, discoveries across the Atlantic, Spain clings more tightly to its idea of Christian unity. The Inquisition becomes both shield and symbol. It reinforces the belief that Spain is chosen, special, destined to uphold orthodoxy as other nations fall into discord. This belief influences everything. Art celebrates Spanish Catholic identity. Literature reveres moral clarity. Architecture reflects harmony and order. Music emphasizes devotion and solemnity. Public rituals highlight unity over individuality. And the Inquisition, once focused narrowly on conversos, now stands at the crossroads of politics, spirituality, information, and culture. Looking ahead to Part 11. In Part 11, we will explore how Spain's global empire transforms the mission of the Inquisition, pulling it into the affairs of South America, the Caribbean, North Africa, and even the Philippines. The world grows larger, and the tribunal's responsibilities grow with it. Part 11. Across oceans and empires, the Inquisition travels with Spain. As we drift into Part 11, imagine a slow-turning globe beneath dim candlelight. The warm glow flickers across oceans, continents, and trade routes that stretch like pale threads across the surface of the world. It is the dawn of a new Spanish empire, a realm that expands far beyond anything the medieval mind thought possible. With the discovery of new lands and the establishment of overseas colonies, Spain becomes a global power. And wherever Spain extends its presence, the Inquisition, sometimes formally, sometimes indirectly, extends a shadow of its influence as well. Let your mind rest gently in this picture. Soft waves roll under large wooden ships. Stars overhead guide navigators who barely understand the enormity of the oceans beneath them. Across these waters, Spain carries its soldiers, settlers, priests, and ideals. Among those ideals is the conviction that faith is the binding thread of empire. The Inquisition, ever vigilant, now finds itself weaving through territories thousands of miles away from the Iberian Peninsula. This chapter follows its quiet journey across oceans. Spain becomes a global power. To understand the Inquisition's expansion, imagine the world as it appeared in the early 16th century. Europe is changing rapidly. Italy is bursting with art and scholarship. The Ottoman Empire dominates the Eastern Mediterranean. And Spain, newly unified, newly confident, turns its attention outward. Christopher Columbus's expedition in 1492, commissioned by the Spanish crown, opens the door to a vast unknown landscape. Soon, explorers such as Cortés and Pizarro claim territories for Spain in the Americas. Settlements rise, missions form, new towns are carved into the edges of jungles, deserts, and mountains. Even across the Pacific, Spanish galleons establish a foothold in the Philippines. With this global reach comes an inevitable concern. Spain does not merely want to conquer land, it wants to shape communities. It wants unity across distant shores, unity in values, unity in faith. And to the monarchy, the Inquisition is an instrument of that unity. Carefully applied, selectively used, and always watching. Spain's overseas territories now teeter on the delicate balance between indigenous traditions, colonial ambitions, missionary zeal, and the uncertainties of cultural blending. Into this mosaic, the Inquisition steps carefully. The Inquisition in the New World, a slow, cautious arrival. Unlike in mainland Spain, where the tribunal operates openly and vigorously, the Inquisition's presence in the Americas grows gradually and with unique limitations. Indigenous peoples, newly encountered and deeply diverse, are not brought under the Inquisition's authority in its early years. The Church considers them neophytes, new to Christianity, still learning, still forming a spiritual identity. Their religious practices are approached not with tribunals but with missionary education, persuasion, and a mixture of admiration and misunderstanding. But for Spaniards, Africans, converted Jews, converted Muslims, and foreign travelers within colonial society, the Inquisition observes silently from the periphery. It watches for unauthorized religious preachers, foreign sailors spreading prohibited ideas, settlers practicing unapproved rituals, Jewish or Islamic customs carried by conversos, small sects forming outside church supervision, colonists engaging in magical or occult practices, criticisms of church authority disseminated through books or letters. When such concerns grow too large, a formal tribunal may establish an office or send commissioners to investigate. The result is not a mirror of the Spanish Inquisition at home, but a modified version. Adapted to frontier life, shaped by local politics, and influenced by ethnic and cultural complexities unfamiliar in Castile and Aragon. The New World becomes a place of both new freedoms and new fears. Mexico City, Lima, and Cartagena, centers of overseas authority. Three major inquisitorial centers eventually rise in the Spanish territories. Mexico City, Lima, Peru, Cartagena de Indias, in modern Colombia. Each region faces distinct challenges. Mexico City, the cosmopolitan heart of New Spain, Mexico City teems with merchants, scholars, priests, soldiers, and people from across the empire. The Inquisition here focuses heavily on Europeans living abroad, especially those suspected of secretly practicing Judaism or Protestantism. It also investigates matters such as blasphemy, sorcery, Bigamy, a surprisingly common issue in frontier communities. Printing unauthorized texts. The city becomes a laboratory where new forms of cultural mixing and new forms of religious concern appear side by side. Lima. Lima, capital of the Viceroyalty of Peru, handles cases involving Spaniards in the Andes and Pacific coastal regions. The tribunal here grapples with the enormous distance between settlements, the existence of isolated mining communities, and the flow of sailors along trade routes to and from Asia. Cartagena. Cartagena becomes the inquisitorial center of the Caribbean, especially focused on the spiritual regulation of ports. Ships bring sailors from England, the Netherlands, Italy, Africa, and beyond. The tribunal watches carefully for Protestant literature, foreign religious practices, and contraband goods. Each center becomes a quiet guardian, observing and intervening when necessary, but always mindful that the colonies operate under different cultural and spiritual rules than mainland Spain. Missionaries and the Inquisition, a complicated dance. While the Inquisition rarely intervenes directly in indigenous conversion, it keeps a distant eye on the missionary orders, Franciscans, Dominicans, Jesuits, and others, each with its own methods and internal disputes. Some missionaries adopt surprisingly gentle approaches, studying local languages, documenting indigenous histories, and advocating for indigenous rights. Others take a stricter path, condemning centuries-old rituals as dangerous or demonic. These internal disagreements sometimes reach the Inquisition's ears. The tribunal steps in only when missionary practices appear to risk doctrinal confusion. It does not police the daily work of missionaries, but it remains the ultimate authority on theological boundaries. Imagine a missionary deep in the forests of South America, learning the speech patterns of a tribe, building friendship with a local chief, translating prayers into a language never heard in Europe. Far away, in an office in Mexico City or Lima, an inquisitor quietly receives reports and letters about the missionary's progress, ensuring that enthusiasm never leads to doctrinal improvisation. It is a slow, distant oversight, but oversight nonetheless. Foreign influence, a constant concern. As Spain expands globally, it becomes increasingly aware of its rivals, France, England, the Netherlands, and emerging Protestant states. Ships from these regions sometimes arrive in Spanish harbors, intentionally or by accident. Their sailors carry pamphlets from the Reformation, political propaganda, philosophical books, new scientific theories, foreign religious customs. Some carry none of these. Others carry too much. The Inquisition grows particularly wary of foreign influence, especially anything that might weaken the unity of faith in scattered colonies. Inspections are common in major ports. Letters and packages are sometimes examined. Unauthorized foreign books are confiscated. Occasionally, foreign preachers or merchants are questioned before being allowed to continue their journey. And yet, even here, the tribunal operates with a strange balance. It knows that Spain needs trade, diplomacy, and commerce. Its goal is not to isolate the empire but to protect it from ideological fragments that might drift in like embers on a coastal wind. Everyday life under overseas inquisition. Imagine life in a Spanish colonial town. A bookseller arranges imported volumes beneath a wooden awning. A missionary returns from a distant village, carrying notes written in an indigenous language. A merchant unloads cases of textiles or spices from Asia. Families attend Mass in a newly built stone church. Sailors recount stories of storms and foreign ports. The presence of the Inquisition is sometimes as subtle as a whisper. A rumor of a forbidden book. A traveling scholar asked a few gentle questions. A letter held briefly for inspection. A passerby lowering his voice when discussing a controversial idea. The colonies are not ruled by fear. They are ruled by a sense that faith, exploration, and imperial ambition must move carefully together, like three musicians maintaining harmony in a new composition. The empire grows, and so does the tribunal's responsibility. As more lands fall under Spanish rule, the Inquisition's workload broadens. It becomes not just a regulator of heresy but a quiet guardian of cohesion. An institution that maintains the moral and doctrinal thread that binds distant regions into one spiritual fabric. This global role is subtle, restrained, and deeply intertwined with Spain's identity as both a worldly empire and a kingdom rooted in Catholic tradition. Looking ahead to Part 12. In Part 12, we will explore the psychological impact of the Inquisition. How ordinary people perceived it, how it shaped family life, and how it influenced Spanish culture, not only through fear but through ritual, symbolism, and the collective imagination. Part 12. Whispers in the Hearthlight, Daily Life Under the Inquisition. Settle in gently as Part 12 begins. Imagine the warm hush of a Spanish evening centuries ago. Picture a small stone home in Castile or Aragon, the kind with a low wooden door, a hearth glowing in the corner, and shadows stretching across uneven walls as the coals burn low. Outside, the night air is cool, the streets narrow and quiet. A distant church bell marks the passing hour, echoing softly through the town. Inside, a family gathers. Perhaps a mother mends a garment by candlelight. A father sorts wheat or olive pits on the table. A few children listen drowsily as an older sibling reads aloud from a devotional book. The room feels peaceful, grounded, safe. And yet, beneath this familiar rhythm of life, there is another layer. A soft, barely perceptible hum of caution. This is not fear in the dramatic sense, not terror or constant anxiety. Rather, it is something subtler, woven into the fabric of daily living like an almost invisible thread. It is the awareness of the Inquisition, a presence that, while often distant, shapes how people speak, how they pray, how they understand one another, and how they navigate the boundaries of faith. Tonight's chapter explores that subtle shadow. Not the tribunals or the punishments but the psychology of living in a world where religious identity is deeply examined and deeply valued, and where the Inquisition exists as both guardian and judge. Let us walk slowly into this quieter landscape. The Inquisition as a constant background presence. For many people in medieval and early modern Spain, the Inquisition was not something encountered personally. They did not appear before tribunals. They were never arrested. They never saw an auto de fe except maybe from a distant crowd. But they heard of things. Stories traveled from village to village, from market stalls to taverns, from church steps to farmhouses. These stories ranged from exaggerated hearsay to careful accounts of real cases. And they created an atmosphere, soft, pervasive, and psychological rather than physical. Think of it like a breeze that drifts through an open window. Sometimes it barely stirs the air. Other times it brushes your cheek and reminds you that the world outside is larger and more complex than the world within your home. The Inquisition lived in that quiet breeze. It inspired people to stay aligned with expected practices not because they were constantly policed, but because those practices formed part of the identity of the nation, the church, and the community. A culture of caution, not panic. It is easy to imagine a society overwhelmed by fear. But that is not the reality of most towns. Daily life continued peacefully. Markets bustled. Cities grew. Art and literature flourished. Families celebrated saints' days, weddings, and harvests. In many ways, life felt stable. The psychological influence of the Inquisition worked more like an internal compass, subtly guiding what was appropriate to say and how to move within one's social environment. A few small examples help illustrate this. At the dinner table, people usually avoided theological debates during meals. Conversation stayed comfortably within accepted ideas. Not out of terror, but because controversial discussions felt socially risky. Not rude, not illegal, but simply unnecessary. In public spaces, travelers in taverns or inns sometimes spoke cautiously around strangers. Spain was a land of many backgrounds: conversos, moriscos, old Christians, foreigners. Words carried weight. In writing, letters often included careful wording. People avoided ambiguous phrasing that might be misinterpreted if read by others. This world was shaped not by constant surveillance, but by the collective desire to be aligned with the values of the community, to avoid misunderstandings, and to live in harmony with neighbors. Religious ritual becomes social ritual. Because Spain saw religious unity as foundational to its identity, rituals took on deep cultural meaning. Attending Mass regularly, fasting, celebrating holy days, and participating in processions were not merely private acts of devotion. They were visible expressions of belonging. A person who did not participate might invite questions, not because they were suspected of heresy, but because communal belonging was a cherished value. Imagine a village procession on a warm spring evening. Candles glow along the cobblestone street. Children carry flowers. A priest walks at the front with an ornate cross. Bells ring softly from the church tower. The air smells of frankincense and orange blossoms. It is peaceful, beautiful, communal. And most people join in because it feels natural, familial, and spiritually nourishing. The Inquisition's expectations are present, but they do not overshadow the emotional experience. They simply reinforce the importance of shared tradition. The quiet fear of being misunderstood. One of the most delicate psychological impacts came from misunderstandings. A neighbor might remark that someone lit candles at unusual hours. Or that someone did not eat pork. Or that someone made herbal remedies that seemed unusual. These things might have innocent explanations, yet they could stir whispers. And so people learn to be mindful of how their actions appeared to others. Not to perform faith dishonestly, but to avoid confusion or unnecessary attention. This dynamic rarely erupted into hostility. Instead, it produced a culture where clarity mattered, where families explained customs openly, and where pastors guided communities in living visibly Christian lives. The emotional landscape of conversos and moriscos. For converted Jews and Muslims, known as conversos and moriscos, the psychological weight could be heavier. Imagine the child of a family that converted generations ago, who practices Christianity sincerely but occasionally hears a neighbor suggest that their grandparents weren't like us. This lingering sense of difference shaped self-perception. Some conversos and moriscos found acceptance quickly. Others lived with a faint awareness that their lineage could attract curiosity. Their houses may have looked the same as any old Christian home. Their prayers sounded the same. Their daily rhythms matched their neighbors. But cultural memories and identity carried layers that sometimes made them more cautious. This internal complexity, wanting to belong fully, fearing misinterpretation, became part of their emotional world. The role of confessors and priests in daily anxiety. Many Spaniards relied on local priests for guidance. Confessors often acted as emotional anchors, helping people distinguish between genuine spiritual concerns and unnecessary worry. A priest might reassure someone who feared that a misphrased comment could be misinterpreted, or soothe a young woman who worried her piety wasn't sincere enough, or calm a man who fretted that he had made a harmless mistake in a ritual. In this way, clergy softened the psychological effects of the Inquisition, offering clarity, compassion, and perspective. Dreams, stories, and the imagination. Over time, the Inquisition became part of Spain's collective imagination. People told stories, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes symbolic, that worked almost like cautionary tales. These stories appeared in plays, poems, letters, and later in artworks. Some dramatized the Inquisition's power, others depicted more romanticized, softened images. Children grew up hearing such stories, and though many details were embellished, they created a cultural mythology. These myths taught boundaries and reinforced community identity. The influence was subtle but lasting. Living with the Inquisition. A soft shadow, not a crushing weight. To summarize this emotional landscape, picture once more the quiet home at dusk. A soft candle burns. A prayer is whispered. Bread is broken. A family rests. In this setting, the Inquisition is not a monster lurking in the darkness. It is more like a firm, distant figure whose presence shapes the contours of behavior but does not dominate the soul. Most people sleep peacefully. Most never encounter a tribunal. And life continues in its steady, rhythmic way. Woven from ritual, family, church, and community. The Inquisition's psychological influence is subtle, powerful, but not always oppressive. It is a complex phenomenon, one that shaped a society's internal world as much as its external institutions. Looking ahead to Part 13. In Part 13, we will explore the role of fear, rumor, and misinformation. How exaggerated stories spread, how anxiety sometimes flourished without cause, and how communities grappled with the line between reality and imagination. Part 13. Rumors, Echoes, and the Shape of Fear. As Part 13 begins, imagine settling deeper into a quiet, dimly lit room. The kind of space where shadows rest gently in the corners and the flicker of a single candle washes the walls in warm, amber softness. Outside, night has fallen over a Spanish town centuries ago. Crickets hum softly. A cool wind moves through the narrow streets. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell sounds the late hour. Inside this stillness, we turn our attention to one of the most intangible yet influential forces in any society, rumor. Not the loud, destructive kind that defines political uprisings or major scandals, but the gentler, subtler currents that weave their way through communities, shaping emotions, coloring conversations, and influencing how people perceive the world around them. During the centuries of the Spanish Inquisition, rumors often filled the spaces between what people knew and what they imagined. They were the whispers that threaded through markets, doorways, and church courtyards. They were the stories half believed, half feared, often shaped less by fact than by the emotional needs of a society navigating change, uncertainty, and shifting identities. Tonight's chapter explores the psychology of rumor in this world. How it began, how it spread, how it influenced daily life, and how the Inquisition's very existence, even when distant, could magnify these quiet voices. Take a slow breath, let your shoulders relax, and drift with me into this landscape of echoes and softened fears. The social roots of rumor. Rumors often sprout where facts are scarce. In the medieval and early modern world, news traveled slowly. Few people could read. Newspapers as we know them did not exist. Official announcements were rare and sometimes cryptic. Most information came through traveling merchants, priests and preachers, visiting relatives, passing soldiers, and conversations in public squares. A single unusual event, the traveler arrested on the outskirts of a town, a priest summoned to speak with an inquisitorial visitor, a neighbor questioned about a religious ceremony, could develop a life of its own once retold. Not because people intended harm, but because humans everywhere tend to fill the unknown with meaning. Rumors often emerge gently, beginning with a simple question. Did you hear what happened near Toledo? Someone said the Inquisition is reviewing practices in the next village. My cousin swears a priest asked unusual questions during confession. And in the absence of clarity, such small sparks could become quiet flames. Rumors as a form of emotional processing. It is important to understand that rumors were not always malicious. Many were expressions of anxiety, attempts to make sense of a world that felt uncertain. When communities heard that the Inquisition had opened an investigation elsewhere, even if it had nothing to do with them, they might begin to worry. Does this mean something is changing? Are we being observed more closely? Should we adjust our routines? In this way, rumors acted as emotional release valves. They allowed people to voice their concerns indirectly, in a way that felt safer than speaking of their own fears. Imagine a group of villagers gathered at dusk after a day in the fields. They speak softly, leaning in close, sharing things they've heard. Some stories are exaggerated. Some contain kernels of truth. Some are misinterpretations of events far away. But the act of sharing brings comfort. By repeating the rumor, reshaping it, and discussing it, the community processes its collective emotions. Rumor becomes a way of bonding, a ritual of navigating uncertainty together. The exaggeration of the Inquisition's reach. While the Inquisition certainly held real authority, its reach in daily life was far more limited than rumors suggested. Yet people tended to imagine it as everywhere. Not in a fearful sense of constant terror, but in the softer, more atmospheric sense of an unseen presence. This impression grew through stories of auto de fees retold dramatically. Tales from faraway towns embellished with each telling. Legends about secret informants. Misunderstandings about Inquisition procedures. Or simple speculation about who might be under scrutiny. Most Spaniards never interacted with the institution directly. But rumors created a psychological sense of proximity. Like hearing thunder from a distant storm, you know it's not overhead, but its presence lingers at the edges of awareness. The role of confessors in calming rumors. Priests often found themselves at the center of rumor control. Parishioners brought their concerns, their fears, their stories. A kind priest might gently correct misunderstandings, lowering anxieties. Another might unintentionally heighten fears by being vague or overly cautious. Confessors knew that clarity could stabilize a community. If a rumor grew too strong, clergy might address it during a sermon, softly, with reassurance, grounding the congregation in truth and faith. Through these interactions, rumors became opportunities for pastoral care, moments where emotional burdens could be lightened. Rumors among conversos and moriscos. For Spain's conversos, Jewish converts, and moriscos, Muslim converts, rumors carried added weight. A whisper that someone's relative had been questioned in another town could cause unease. Not panic, most people lived peacefully, but a quiet thoughtfulness. Will this affect us? Are people suspicious? What does this mean for our family? Some families lived with generations of subtle caution. They maintained Christian devotion sincerely, but also understood that misunderstanding was possible. Rumors served as reminders of their delicate position within the social fabric, reminders that identity was layered and sometimes scrutinized. Yet many converso and morisco communities found strength in their unity. Whispers encouraged them to be supportive of one another, to avoid unnecessary risks, and to foster close ties that protected their families. The marketplace as the heart of rumor. Markets were the center of community life. They were noisy, colorful, filled with the smells of spices, olives, meats, cloth, and fresh bread. They were also the crossroads of gossip. A merchant arriving from another city might unknowingly set off a wave of speculation simply by mentioning an event he barely understood. If he mentioned an inquisitor traveling through the region, the details might multiply as they spread. He was questioning people. He was looking for specific families. He was preparing for an investigation. He wasn't alone. Even if none of these things were true. Rumors followed the natural rhythm of the marketplace, growing, shrinking, bending with the seasons. Stories as social memory. Over time, rumors solidified into community legends. A trial that happened hundreds of miles away might become part of a village's folklore. A single arrest might become 3 arrests in later tellings. A misunderstanding might become a permanent tale of vigilance. These stories shaped how villages remembered the Inquisition. Not as a set of official procedures, but as a cultural presence, vague, shifting, larger than life. And in this way, rumor became part of Spain's collective memory, blending fact and emotion into long-lasting narratives. Fear, but softened through time. The fear associated with the Inquisition was not sharp or constant for most people. It was diffuse, ambient, woven into the hum of daily life. Like the sound of the sea heard from a distance. Like the knowledge that winter will come, even on a warm autumn day. Like the awareness of a distant authority that might someday reach your town, but probably will not. Rumors amplified this soft fear, but they also helped communities process it. Through shared stories, laughter, speculation, and cautionary tales, people made sense of a world where religion shaped identity and where deviations, whether real or perceived, held social significance. This shared emotional processing brought communities together as often as it pushed them apart. Looking ahead to Part 14. In Part 14, we will explore the case files and trial records of the Inquisition, not the dramatic versions, but the quiet, human stories behind them. We will examine how inquisitors questioned suspects, how confessions were taken, how misunderstandings were resolved, and how the internal machinery of the tribunal worked with a blend of rigidity and routine procedure. Part 14. Inside the tribunal, the quiet machinery of inquisitorial procedure. Part 14 opens with the image of a still, early morning in late 15th century Spain. The sun has not yet lifted above the rooftops, and the streets of a regional town remain hushed, washed in bluish pre-dawn light. A baker tends his oven. A few roosters crow in the distance. Smoke rises faintly from chimneys. The world feels half asleep, quiet enough that even small sounds seem amplified, as if the town itself is listening. Within this soft morning stillness, a building at the edge of the main plaza stands with its shutters drawn. From the outside it looks unremarkable: thick stone walls, a wooden door, a modest cross above the entrance. But inside, this building contains the administrative heart of the local tribunal of the Spanish Inquisition. Contrary to the dramatic images that later centuries have painted, inquisitorial offices were often tidy, bureaucratic spaces. The rooms smelled of ink, parchment, tallow candles, and the slightly metallic tinge of cold stone floors. Paperwork filled wooden shelves. Quills rested in ink pots. Wax seals lay ready beside folded documents. It is into this environment, quiet, methodical, and surprisingly ordinary, that we step tonight. Not into a moment of drama or crisis, but into the routine workings of inquisitorial procedure. Tonight we explore what actually happened behind the closed doors of a tribunal, and how these processes, though serious, were far more measured and procedural than the later myths suggest. Settle yourself, slow your breathing, and let the details drift around you like soft candlelight on a stone wall. The arrival of a case. Nearly all inquisitorial cases began not with arrest, but with information collection. An inquisitor might receive a letter from a priest, a report from a local official, a note from someone in the community, or testimony provided during a routine visitation. These documents were placed into the tribunal's registry and reviewed quietly over the course of days or weeks. Many reports were dismissed immediately: misunderstandings, personal grudges, or concerns with no evidence. When a case did move forward, it transitioned into a phase known as the information. During this stage, inquisitorial staff conducted discreet inquiries, speaking with village priests, asking neighbors about behavior, reviewing parish records, checking for previous complaints, and verifying whether the individual had a reputation for good Christian practice. Contrary to sensationalized images, this phase was often slow and careful. The tribunal sought to confirm patterns, not isolate individual oddities. A single comment almost never prompted action. Inquisitors wanted consistency before proceeding. This early filtering process prevented thousands of false accusations from advancing. The summons, calm, formal, and often private. If concerns persisted, the tribunal issued a summons, not an arrest warrant, but an invitation to appear voluntarily. The tone of the summons was formal, not threatening. It instructed the individual to come at a specific time, often for a friendly preliminary conversation. Many people approached these meetings with nervousness, but not terror. They arrived as one might approach a conversation with a bishop or magistrate, aware of authority, but not expecting violence. Inside, the tribunal room was simple. A wooden desk, a crucifix, a chair for the inquisitor, a chair for the examinee, a clerk with ink and parchment. Candles flickered. The atmosphere was hushed, steady, almost scholarly. The questioning, calm, repetitive, and focused on clarity. Inquisitors preferred clarity over confrontation. Rather than lashing out or shouting, they typically asked, "Explain your understanding of this prayer. Describe how you observe Sundays. What customs does your family follow? When did you last confess? Do you know why you were called here?" These questions, though serious, were not dramatic. They were meant to uncover patterns of belief, not to trap or intimidate. The inquisitor listened quietly. The clerk transcribed each response. If statements were unclear, the inquisitor asked again, sometimes multiple times, comparing answers to ensure reliability. Many cases ended right here. An explanation satisfied the tribunal. A misunderstanding was cleared. A rumor proved false. The person returned home relieved, often advised to avoid certain behaviors that might look suspicious but never punished. These quiet resolutions happened far more often than trials. When a case advanced, the formal accusation. Only in a minority of cases did the tribunal move forward with a formal accusation. This step required at least 2 independent witnesses, consistent testimonies, evidence of unorthodox practices or teachings. Even then, the tribunal often offered the suspect a chance to confess voluntarily, promising leniency. The goal was correction, not destruction. If the person agreed to acknowledge errors, whether ritual mistakes, misunderstood doctrines, or lapses in practice, the case often ended with a short period of penance, renewed commitment to the sacraments, or religious instruction. This pattern reflected the Inquisition's self-defined mission to restore rather than eradicate. The trial room, a space of procedure, not spectacle. When formal proceedings occurred, they took place in a chamber designed for procedure, not drama. Imagine a narrow room filled with the earthy scent of candles, parchment, and old wood. The air is cool. A crucifix hangs on the wall. Clerks sit with quills poised. An inquisitor presides with the calm authority of a judge. The accused sits quietly, often with legal representation. Yes, the Inquisition allowed defense lawyers, known as procuradors. Trials followed a structured order. Presentation of accusations. Reading of evidence. Testimonies of witnesses. Explanations by the accused. Examination of intention. Recommendations for resolution. Much time was spent parsing intentions. Was the accused willfully deviating from church teaching? Or were they simply confused? Or influenced by old habits inherited from ancestors? Or repeating something misunderstood? This focus on intention is one of the most misunderstood aspects of the Inquisition. The tribunal wanted to understand why a person acted as they did. Punishments were not assigned mechanically, they were tailored to the situation, often mild, and usually aimed at reconciliation. Confession, a path to restoration. Confessions were not always forced. Many individuals confessed willingly, especially if they feared that silence might harm their families or community reputation. A confession often led to resolution. Recitation of prayers. Attendance at Mass. Charitable acts. Wearing a penitential garment. Or brief correction by clergy. Only in rare, severe cases, usually involving repeat offenders or deliberate heretical spread, did matters escalate into harsher penalties. For the vast majority, a confession marked the end of anxiety and the return to normal life. After the verdict, return to daily rhythms. When a case concluded, people slipped back into daily life quietly. A man returned to his fields. A woman to her loom. A family to its evening prayers. Trials, even when stressful, rarely ended with permanent disruption. Life resumed its rhythms, routines softened anxieties, communities moved on. For many towns, tribunal activity came in waves. Long stretches of quiet punctuated by occasional investigations. The machinery of the Inquisition, though powerful, moved slowly, methodically, and far less dramatically than the popular imagination suggests. Looking ahead to Part 15. In Part 15, we will step outside the tribunal and into the town square, exploring how autos de fe developed, how they changed over the centuries, and what they meant to the communities that gathered to witness them. Not sensationalized events, but ritualized expressions of repentance, ceremony, and public reaffirmation. Part 15. The auto de fe, ritual, ceremony, and the quiet weight of public penance. Part 15 begins with the slow rising of the sun over a Spanish town square. Imagine a soft golden glow washing over rooftops of terracotta and timber. The air is cool. The streets smell faintly of morning bread and dew settling on stone. Vendors are beginning to set up their stalls, murmuring quietly to one another as they unwrap bundles of fruit, cloth, and simple household items. The bells of a parish church ring gently, announcing that today is a day not of ordinary business, but of solemn gathering. For the town has been preparing, slowly and methodically, for an event known across Spain, the auto de fe. Though the term conjures intense images in modern memory, we approach it here with calm clarity, examining it not as drama but as ritual, an elaborate, carefully structured public ceremony deeply embedded in the social and religious rhythms of the time. Tonight, let us drift softly into the world of the auto de fe as it actually unfolded for most communities, as a spiritual spectacle, a ceremony of repentance, and a reaffirmation of collective identity. Let the details emerge slowly, like candle flames rising and steadying in a dim cathedral. The purpose behind the ceremony. To understand the atmosphere of an auto de fe, one must understand its purpose. The Inquisition viewed itself, above all, as a guardian of spiritual unity. An auto de fe, literally act of faith, was not conceived as a display of cruelty, but as a public resolution of cases that had already been decided within the tribunal. For most of its history, the ceremony served to demonstrate reconciliation, affirm repentance, and restore the accused to full communion with the Church. Only a very small number of cases resulted in severe penalties, and even fewer led to execution. Those matters belonged to civil authorities, not the Inquisition itself. For the vast majority of participants, the ceremony brought closure, not terror. Think of it as a kind of public spiritual accounting, a ritual for closing the book on cases that had been quietly processed for months or even years. The atmosphere of anticipation. Now imagine the town square slowly filling with people. Families gather in clusters. Farmers arrive from the outskirts. Children cling to their mothers' skirts. Merchants close their stalls early. Priests stand together near the steps of the church, their vestments catching the early sunlight. There is a hush over the square, not fear, but solemnity. A sense that today is important, that something larger than everyday life is unfolding. Some townspeople feel curiosity. Others feel reverence. Many feel something like collective introspection, as though the ceremony offers a moment to reflect on their own moral and spiritual paths. The Inquisition officials arrive late in the morning, not with fanfare, but with quiet formality. Inquisitors wear robes of black and white. Clerks carry scrolls and documents. Behind them, penitents, those whose cases have been resolved, walk in simple garments, sometimes wearing a San Benito, a penitential tunic that symbolizes repentance. These garments are not meant to humiliate but to indicate transformation. A visual reminder that the individual has acknowledged errors and seeks reconciliation. The ritual begins. When the crowd has gathered and the sun has risen enough to warm the square, the ceremony begins. A procession moves slowly toward a platform built for the occasion. Candles flicker in lanterns. Crosses are carried at the front. Choir boys chant hymns in soft, steady voices. The melody drifts upward, mingling with the morning air. The inquisitors take their seats. Priests stand at the ready. The penitents sit nearby, quiet, reflective, often with family members close behind them. There is very little noise beyond the chanting and the occasional cough or murmur from the crowd. The mood is contemplative, gentle, almost suspended in time. Reading of the sentences. A clerk steps forward. He unrolls a parchment slowly, the crackle echoing through the square. And then, in a voice loud enough to reach the edges of the gathering, he begins reading the outcomes of the cases. For many, the sentences include prayers to be recited, attendance at Mass, temporary wearing of the San Benito, small acts of penance, or engagement in religious instruction. Penalties are often mild, underscoring that the Inquisition's goal, when dealing with the ordinary, common cases, was correction rather than condemnation. As each name is read, the penitent rises, bows slightly, and acknowledges the sentence. Sometimes tears fall. Sometimes the person smiles faintly, relieved that the ordeal is over. Family members quietly clasp hands. A few neighbors whisper prayers for forgiveness and renewal. The atmosphere remains soft, almost tender. The role of the sermon. After the reading, a priest steps forward to deliver a sermon. The sermon is not harsh. It is gentle, reflective, and pastoral, focusing on themes such as the importance of unity, the beauty of faith, the danger of misunderstanding religious teachings, and the possibility of redemption for all. The priest rarely speaks of punishment. He speaks instead of community, love, and spiritual renewal. Many in the crowd bow their heads, letting the words wash over them like warm candlelight, soft, steady, comforting. It is in these moments that many historians believe the auto de fe served as a kind of collective spiritual recalibration, reminding communities of shared values and the fragile threads that bind them. The act of reconciliation. Once the sermon concludes, the penitents kneel. Inquisitors, priests, and assistants place their hands gently upon the penitent's shoulders or heads, offering formal absolution and declaring that the individuals are restored to the fullness of the Christian community. This moment often brings visible emotional release, tears, relieved sighs, whispered prayers of gratitude. For many, the ceremony represents not shame but healing, the closing of a painful chapter. The crowd remains silent throughout, respecting the gravity of the moment. Procession to the church. After absolution, the penitents join the clergy in a slow procession to the church. Bells ring softly. The choir resumes chanting. The crowd follows, moving like a single organism through the narrow streets until the church fills with people and the ritual concludes with Mass. This Mass is not somber, it is warm, filled with hymns and gentle sermons about forgiveness and renewal. By midday, the ceremony is complete. The emotional impact on the community. The auto de fe leaves a deep emotional imprint, but not the one modern imagination suggests. For most towns, the ceremony represents closure, spiritual healing, reaffirmation of collective values, and a sense of renewed unity. People return to their lives carrying not fear, but a heightened awareness of their religious identity and their place within the community's moral framework. In the days that follow, conversations around hearthfires and marketplace stalls often revolve around forgiveness, mercy, and the lessons of the ceremony. Neighbors support penitents. Priests provide additional instruction. Life resumes with a softened, reflective tone. In this way, the autodafé functioned not only as a legal ritual but as a deeply emotional one, shaping how individuals understood faith, community, and identity. Looking ahead to Part 16. In Part 16, we will explore the world of Inquisition officials themselves, the inquisitors, notaries, guards, and clerks who lived in the tension between duty, faith, and public perception. We'll examine what their daily routines looked like and how they balanced spiritual conviction with administrative responsibility. Part 16. The Inquisitor's Burden, Lives Behind the Tribunal Walls. Tonight we step quietly behind the scenes. Not into the tribunal chamber itself, which we explored earlier, and not into the town square, where public ceremonies unfolded with solemn ritual. Instead, we enter the private, interior world of the people who made the Spanish Inquisition function day by day. This includes the inquisitors, of course, but also the notaries who wrote in delicate looping script, the guards who kept watch in simple stone corridors, the clerks who organized reams of parchment, and even the cooks and stewards who kept the household running. The Inquisition was not merely a judicial machine. It was a workplace, a set of offices, a residence, and a community. The people within it lived complex, human lives, full of duty, faith, fatigue, doubts, and the small comforts of routine. As Part 16 unfolds, imagine the scene beginning in the early morning, before the sun has fully lifted across the tiled rooftops of a Spanish city. A light mist curls over the ground. The streets are empty except for a few vendors beginning to set out their baskets of figs and olives. Church bells chime softly, drawing a gentle line across the sleeping sky. Inside the inquisitorial residence, part administrative building, part humble monastery, lamps flicker with warm, golden light. The air smells faintly of beeswax, parchment, and the lingering smoke of last night's hearth-fire. It is a world of hushed footsteps, murmured prayers, and quiet preparation. Let us step softly into that world now. The Inquisitor, a life of wait and routine. Contrary to modern imagination, the average Inquisitor was not a fiery zealot, nor a shadowy figure hungry for power. Most were trained scholars, meticulous thinkers, and deeply committed clergy who believed they were protecting Spain's spiritual unity. Their days began early. An inquisitor might rise before dawn, kneeling beside a small wooden bed to whisper prayers in Latin. His room would be sparse. A simple table, a chair, a small chest of clothing, and perhaps a devotional image pinned to the wall. After prayer, he would join other clergy in a modest chapel for morning mass. The sound of chanting, slow and steady, would roll through the stone walls like a soft tide, centering the mind for the long day ahead. Only then would the inquisitor step into his official responsibilities. His work included reviewing reports from parish priests, reading witness statements, evaluating letters from bishops or nobles, consulting canon law, meeting with other tribunal members, and preparing for upcoming interviews. His handwriting would be neat, deliberate, shaped by years of scribal training. He might pause often to reflect, to cross-reference a text, or to pray quietly before making a decision. This was the inquisitor's burden. Not dramatic confrontation, but the slow, weighty work of deciding whether an inquiry should advance, whether a concern was valid, whether a person needed guidance, instruction, or simple reassurance. Many inquisitors privately feared error. Their margins sometimes contain notes like, "Is this sufficient? Is intention clear? Consult Father Motin before proceeding." These notes reveal a hesitancy that rarely appears in public accounts. The notaries, the quiet custodians of memory. If inquisitors made decisions, the notaries preserved them. Notaries were the scribes, the individuals whose elegant pen strokes created the official records we now rely on centuries later. Their desks were often cluttered with scrolls, ink pots, quills trimmed with small knives, and sand or pumice to blot wet ink. Their days were filled with quiet concentration. A notary might spend hours copying testimony, checking dates, or translating a witness's statement from colloquial speech into polished legal phrasing. Their work required precision. A single misplaced word could alter the meaning of an entire testimony. Notaries rarely interacted with the accused. They lived in the realm of ink, parchment, and silence. Many historical scholars consider them among the most important figures of the entire institution, for without their records, the workings of the Inquisition would be largely unknown. And yet, in their own time, they were often anonymous. Their names appear only in the corners of documents, usually accompanied by the simple word escribano. Their world was one of candlelight, careful thought, and the soft scratching of a quill. The guards, ordinary men in a serious job. The guards of the Inquisition were not soldiers in shining armor or fearsome warriors. They were usually local men hired to perform basic duties, ensuring rooms remained secure, guiding visitors, escorting witnesses between chambers, and preventing disturbances. Their uniforms were plain. Their demeanor often gentle. Many served part-time, balancing their inquisitorial work with other occupations, cobblers, farmers, all laborious. Their day consisted of walking slow rounds through stone corridors, carrying lanterns at night, delivering messages, assisting with large ceremonies, and keeping watch over administrative spaces. Only rarely did they manage prisoners, and even then, their responsibilities resembled custodial care more than coercion. Guards were witnesses to the emotional atmosphere of the tribunal. The nervousness of a person arriving for questioning, the relief of someone cleared of suspicion, the murmured prayers of families waiting in courtyards. They saw the human side of the Inquisition more clearly than anyone else. The clerks, cooks, stewards, and servants. Behind every tribunal was a network of quiet workers. Clerks. They organized documents, maintained logs, and ensured that every sheet of parchment found its correct place. They were often young men learning the ropes of administration, hoping for advancement through the church. Cooks. They prepared simple meals, stews, bread, lentils, salted fish. Their kitchens were warm havens within the cold stone buildings, filled with the scents of garlic, rosemary, and simmering broth. Inquisitors and staff shared these meals with surprising informality. Stewards. They kept accounts, purchased supplies, oversaw repairs, and managed the building's upkeep. They interacted with townspeople more than inquisitors did, often becoming the tribunal's informal bridge to the community. Servants. They swept floors, lit candles, scrubbed ink stains from tables, and made beds. Their presence created the soft, nearly invisible rhythm that allowed the tribunal to function smoothly. These individuals rarely appear in historical records, yet their labor sustained the institution. The human side, doubts, weariness, and quiet conversations. Though inquisitors carried authority, they were not immune to emotional complexity. At night, after the administrative work was finished, many retired to small common rooms where they shared modest dinners and spoke softly about their work. Some expressed uncertainty. Did I interpret the testimony correctly? Is this man confused, or is he hiding something? Are we guiding the community well? Others express spiritual concerns, worrying not about the accused, but about themselves. Whether they were acting with enough compassion, whether they had judged too hastily, or whether they were fulfilling God's will. These moments reveal that for many inquisitors, the greatest tension they faced was internal. A day's end in the tribunal. As dusk gathers and the lamps are lit, the building grows quiet. Notaries organize their papers. Clerks close heavy wooden chests filled with files. Guards take their evening rounds, lanterns casting long shadows. A cook scrubs the last of the crockery. A steward completes his accounts. An inquisitor stands alone for a moment in the chapel, saying a final prayer for wisdom before extinguishing the candles. Outside, the streets cool as the night settles. A dog barks in the distance. A child laughs somewhere in a nearby courtyard. Inside, the tribunal becomes still again. Another day completed, another set of burdens carried, another round of decisions made with the tools, beliefs, and limitations of the time. In this quiet, the building sleeps like any other place of work, waiting for dawn. Looking ahead to Part 17. In Part 17, we'll explore how the Inquisition interacted with Spain's monarchy and how royal politics shaped its evolution. We will drift through the royal courts, examining the relationship between crown and clergy and how political agendas influenced inquisitorial activity over the centuries. Part 17. Crown and Cross, the Inquisition and the Spanish Monarchy. Part 17 begins in a place far removed from the dim stone corridors of the tribunal. Tonight, we travel to the glittering royal courts of Spain, where politics intertwined with faith, where kings and queens shaped the destiny of entire kingdoms, and where the Spanish Inquisition found its powerful patronage. Picture the scene slowly. A long hall stretches before you. Its floors polished to a soft sheen, its walls decorated with tapestries depicting saints, battles, and the heraldic symbols of Castile and Aragon. Tall windows filter warm sunlight across carved wooden furniture. Servants move quietly along the edges of the room, their footsteps muffled by woven rugs. Outside, fountains trickle in palace courtyards scented with orange blossoms. In the center of this world sit the monarchs, figures of authority, guardians of Spain's political unity, and, by their own understanding, defenders of the Catholic faith. Their decisions shaped the rise and function of the Inquisition. But their relationship with it was neither simple nor constant. It was layered, subtle, and filled with changing priorities. Tonight we wander gently through that relationship, tracing how the Crown and the Inquisition became partners, how they influenced one another, and how their union defined centuries of Spanish governance. Let your mind drift into this world, where diplomacy blends with spirituality, and where kings and inquisitors navigated each other with both caution and mutual need. The foundations, Ferdinand and Isabella. The story begins with Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, whose marriage in 1469 united their kingdoms into what would become the foundation of modern Spain. They faced a land marked by regional divisions, rival noble families, religious tensions, and lingering political instability from centuries of Muslim-Christian conflict. To them, religious unity was not merely spiritual, it was a pillar of national identity. They believed that a unified faith would strengthen the monarchy, standardize law, and reduce internal conflict. When Ferdinand and Isabella supported the creation of the Spanish Inquisition in 1478, they saw it not as a tool of terror, but as a way to enforce sincerity among converts and ensure cohesion within their growing state. It is essential to remember that, unlike earlier medieval inquisitions run directly by the Church, the Spanish Inquisition was deeply tied to the crown. The monarchs appointed inquisitors. The monarchy received reports. And royal interests influenced the scope of investigations. This relationship made Spain's Inquisition unique. Mutual needs: why the crown relied on the Inquisition. The monarchy turned to the Inquisition for reasons that were not always theological. 1. Social stability. Spain's population included Old Christians, conversos, Jewish converts, moriscos, Muslim converts, recent immigrants, and diverse regional cultures. The monarch saw religious unity as a way to reduce conflict among these communities. 2. Political consolidation. The Inquisition helped diminish the power of nobles or institutions that challenged royal authority. It did this not through executions, but through oversight, record-keeping, and the quiet influence of its jurisdiction. 3. Administrative reach. The Inquisition's network of correspondents, priests, and officials acted as an informal information system for the crown. Through it, monarchs could understand problems arising in distant territories. Financial considerations. Although not the primary motive, confiscations from convicted heretics sometimes supported the treasury. Over time, however, financial gain was limited and strictly regulated. The monarchy found in the Inquisition a partner capable of strengthening centralized rule. Why the Inquisition needed the crown? The relationship flowed in both directions. The Inquisition depended on royal protection, funding, legal authority, and administrative support. Without the crown, the institution would have lacked the political stability needed to operate. Meanwhile, the crown used the Inquisition to enforce orthodoxy and reinforce loyalty across its expanding empire. This partnership became one of the defining features of early modern Spain, a symbiosis of governance and religion. Charles V, defender of her expanding empire. When Charles V inherited the Spanish crown, as Charles I of Spain, he also inherited vast overseas territories and a Europe descending into religious upheaval. Martin Luther's Reformation spread rapidly. Protestant ideas traveled across borders through merchants, diplomats, and sailors. While Spain remained officially unified in its Catholic identity, Charles feared the infiltration of Protestant texts and ideas. The Inquisition, under his reign, shifted to include monitoring of foreign books, examination of imported manuscripts, scrutiny of scholars with European connections, and cautious control over universities. The goal was not to crush intellectual life. Spain had thriving schools and brilliant thinkers, but to ensure that the country did not fracture along the same sectarian lines dividing the rest of Europe. To help with this task, the Crown allowed the Inquisition to develop a censorship arm, leading to indexes of prohibited texts. These measures were more administrative than dramatic, focused mostly on consistency, record-keeping, and maintaining doctrinal clarity. Philip II, the height of collaboration. Under Philip II, the synergy between Crown and Inquisition reached its peak. Philip was deeply devout, meticulous, and personally invested in religious matters. He saw himself as God's steward, responsible for preserving Catholic orthodoxy across his sprawling territories. During his reign, the Inquisition expanded its bureaucratic structure. More tribunals were established. The indexing of books became more systematized. Morisco populations received increased scrutiny. and foreign travelers were monitored with greater care. Yet even then, the atmosphere was not one of constant fear. Most Spaniards lived their lives with only occasional awareness of inquisitorial presence. Philip's aim was stability, not widespread persecution. And despite his strong support, he still exercised caution. Several times, he intervened to prevent overzealous inquisitors from acting on unverified claims. His relationship with the institution was one of paternal oversight rather than blind endorsement. Later monarchs, balancing reform and tradition. By the 17th century, Spain's political concerns shifted. Economic challenges, military conflicts, changing European alliances, and the fading influence of Spain's once mighty empire. Monarchs still valued the Inquisition, but its role became increasingly administrative and symbolic. Under the Bourbons in the 18th century, especially Charles III, pressure grew to modernize. Enlightenment ideas swept through Europe, though Spain adopted them cautiously. Triangular tensions emerged among progressive royal ministers, traditional clergy, and inquisitorial leadership. During this era, the Crown periodically limited inquisitorial jurisdiction, tightened finances, and restructured certain procedures. But it never abolished the institution outright, at least not until centuries later. The result was a slow, gentle decline in inquisitorial influence, without dramatic collapse. A relationship of nuance, not caricature. It is easy to imagine the Crown's relationship to the Inquisition in absolute terms, either total control or total separation. In reality, it was a delicate dance of shared goals, mutual reliance, political tension, religious conviction, and constant negotiation. Monarchs valued the Inquisition as a stabilizing force, but they also monitored it closely, intervening when necessary and shaping its evolution through edicts, appointments, and oversight. This partnership between monarchy and Inquisition shaped Spain's character for centuries, weaving together governance, faith, culture, and identity. Looking ahead to Part 18. In Part 18, we will explore how ordinary townspeople perceived the Inquisition, not officials, not penitents, but everyday Spaniards observing from afar. We will drift through their stories, emotions, misunderstandings, and the shared social imagination that surrounded the institution. Part 18. The View from the Village: How Ordinary People Understood the Inquisition. As Part 18 begins, imagine yourself drifting into a quiet Spanish village at dusk, sometime in the late 15th or early 16th century. The sun has just slipped behind rolling hills, leaving behind a wash of soft lavender light. Smoke curls gently from chimneys. Dogs bark in the distance. A few lanterns glow along the cobblestone paths. The air carries the faint scent of olive trees and freshly baked bread cooling on windowsills. This is not the world of inquisitors, nor tribunals, nor royal courts. This is the world of cobblers and shepherds, millers and midwives, weavers and farmers, ordinary people whose lives moved in slow, steady rhythms, marked more by harvests and feast days than by political decrees or theological debates. Tonight we enter their perspective. Because the Inquisition, as an institution, lived not only in its chambers and offices but also in the imaginations, conversations, and assumptions of the people who resided far from its centers of power. Their understanding was shaped by rumor, ritual, pastoral instruction, and the emotional landscapes that colored village life. Settle in as we wander through that emotional terrain with gentle steps. The Inquisition as a distant force, not a daily threat. For most Spaniards, Especially those in small towns and rural regions, the Inquisition was a distant presence, something that existed far away in cities like Seville, Toledo, Valladolid, Zaragoza, or Barcelona. A villager might go months, years, or even decades without seeing an inquisitor or hearing of a local case. Life was dominated by tending crops, caring for livestock, repairing homes, attending Mass, observing saints' feast days, arranging marriages, raising children, preparing for winter. The Inquisition rarely entered this domestic world directly. To many, it felt like a faraway court of learned clergy, similar to a bishop's office, important, powerful, but not something that intruded into the quietness of their daily routine. And so the Inquisition's presence was ambient, like a distant bell whose chime one grows accustomed to, acknowledging but not fearing. How news spread to small communities. Information arrived slowly. A wandering merchant might pass through and, over a cup of wine, mention that someone in a neighboring town had been questioned. A priest might reference an inquisitorial decree during a sermon. A traveling laborer might share a story overheard in a city. These tidings drifted into the village like seeds on the wind, sometimes taking root, sometimes passing away. Villagers pieced together impressions. That the Inquisition protected the faith. That it concerned itself with misteaching. That it watched over conversos and moriscos. That its officials were devout, educated men. And that its workings were deliberate, not chaotic. But these impressions were usually vague. Few people knew the intricate procedures described in previous chapters. Few understood the emphasis on intention, the layers of review, or the slow pace of investigations. Instead, they held a simpler vision. The Inquisition was a spiritual guardian, something like a stern but distant priest overseeing the country's soul. Fear, when it existed, was soft and diffuse. The fear that lived in some communities was not sharp or constant. It was more like a cool breeze on an autumn evening, a reminder that the world contained forces larger than oneself. People might avoid unusual behavior not because they felt hunted, but because stepping outside of communal norms already felt uncomfortable. Social cohesion was deeply valued in rural Spain. A person might decide not to voice unorthodox theological ideas. Not to skip Mass too often. Not to openly challenge a local priest. Not to preserve strange customs inherited from ancestors. The Inquisition was one layer of this instinct for conformity, but not the only one. Much of it came from the village itself, from neighbors, family elders, and the long-standing traditions that shaped communal life. The Inquisition merely reinforced rhythms that already existed. The role of parish priests in shaping perceptions. Parish priests were the bridge between villagers and the larger world of church authority. Most priests were gentle, familiar figures in village life. They baptized children, blessed marriages, comforted the dying, blessed harvests, and mediated disputes. They also explained, in soft homilies, what the Inquisition actually cared about. Sincerity in confession. Correct understanding of Christian teachings. Avoidance of superstitions. Respect for sacraments. An awareness of errors inherited from families who converted in past generations. Many villagers learned about the Inquisition not from direct contact, but through these calm, pastoral explanations. A priest might say, the Inquisition reminds us to guard our hearts, or their work ensures that we remain united in faith. In this way, the Inquisition became intertwined with spiritual education rather than fear. Social dynamics in mixed communities. In towns with conversos or moriscos, the Inquisition's presence was felt more keenly, but again, often indirectly. A converso family might be careful to appear especially devout. A morisco home might discuss when to invite neighbors for festivals. Some families lived with a faint awareness that old customs needed to be adapted or abandoned. But even here, the essential experience was not terror. Many conversos rose to prominence as bankers, scholars, merchants, or officials. Many moriscos were valued for their agricultural expertise. Social life was complex, woven from trust, suspicion, affection, rivalry, and economic ties. The Inquisition was a factor in this, but not the defining one. For some, it created anxiety. For others, it created reassurance. For most, it simply added a layer of caution to how they presented themselves publicly. How myths and stories filled gaps in knowledge. Without direct experience, villagers often filled gaps with stories. Some were dramatic, exaggerated over time. Others were softened and turned into moral lessons. A mother might tell a child, "Always speak truthfully. The Inquisition values honesty." Or, "Avoid strange practices, they bring confusion." These stories became part of Spanish folklore, blending fear, respect, and imagination. Some imagined inquisitors as severe judges. Others imagined them as wise guardians. Few truly understood the bureaucratic, orderly, and often mundane reality. But in these stories, Spain processed its anxieties about purity, belonging, and tradition. The emotional meaning of an inquisitor's arrival. On rare occasions, an inquisitor visited a small town. This arrival was seldom dramatic. An inquisitor might come quietly, accompanied by a few assistants, staying for a couple of days to check parish records or follow up on a long-standing matter. Villagers watched with curiosity. From balconies. From doorways. From shaded corners of the plaza. Children whispered. Elders straightened their posture. Priests prepared careful notes. For most villagers, the inquisitor's visit was intriguing but not horrifying. The event created a moment of unity, reminding the village of its shared identity. When the inquisitor left, life swiftly returned to normal. The quiet social benefits. Though the Inquisition is remembered harshly in modern imagination, many villagers saw benefits. It discouraged false prophets. It restrained magical healers who harmed more than helped. It prevented local feuds from escalating into chaos. It balanced disputes about doctrine that might have destabilized communities. Whether these benefits were real or simply perceived, they shaped villagers' emotional relationship with the institution. The Inquisition was not universally feared. In some regions, it was welcomed as a stabilizing force. A delicate balance of misunderstanding and trust. To summarize the emotional landscape, most villagers knew little about the Inquisition's internal workings. They relied on priests, travelers, and rumors for information. They feared being misunderstood more than being accused. They saw the institution as distant, not looming. It represented order, unity, and stability, even if imperfectly. This is why the Inquisition held such enduring influence, not because of constant enforcement, but because it lived in the collective imagination with a unique blend of respect, caution, and cultural mythology. Looking ahead to Part 19. In Part 19, we will turn to the topic of secret Judaism, secret Islam, and hidden religious identities, not in a sensationalized way, but gently, exploring the real emotional journeys of conversos and moriscos who struggled between inherited customs and public expectations.
Part 19. Hidden Faiths and Quiet Hearts, the Inner Lives of Conversos and Moriscos. As Part 19 opens, let the nighttime stillness of early modern Spain settle around you. Picture a quiet courtyard lit only by the soft glow of an oil lamp. The leaves of an old orange tree stir faintly in a warm breeze, and the sound of water trickling from a stone fountain creates a soothing, rhythmic backdrop. The sky stretches above in deep indigo, studded with silver stars. In this peaceful space, we pause to explore one of the most intimate and complex human dimensions of the era, the quiet, interior world of those who lived between two identities. The Inquisition, for all its legal structure and public authority, touched lives most deeply not through trials but through the private choices people made in the shadows of night. Conversos and moriscos, families of Jewish or Muslim origin who had converted to Christianity, carried with them layers of memory, fear, hope, longing, and spiritual uncertainty. Their experience was neither wholly tragic nor wholly peaceful. It was a mosaic of small, emotional truths shaped by generations caught between inherited heritage and expected allegiance. Tonight we step gently into their world, one of whispered traditions, hesitant prayers, and the quiet longing to remain authentic in a society that rewarded outward uniformity. A life between worlds. For many conversos, descendants of Jews who had converted in 1391, 1492, or any time in between, identity was not a simple matter. A child born in 1520 to converso parents never knew Judaism directly. Yet they might have recognized certain customs in their home. The lighting of candles on Friday evenings without explanation. A preference for eating separately from the main household on certain nights. A quiet avoidance of pork, explained as an old family custom. A habit of washing hands in a particular bowl before meals. Whispers of ancestors who had lived differently. These were fragments, echoes, rather than fully understood rituals. Many converso families no longer possessed full knowledge of their ancestral faith. What remained were gestures, preferences, instincts, threads left intact after years of adaptation. For moriscos, Muslims forced to convert after 1502 in Castile and 1526 in Aragon. The experience was similar, though grounded in different memories. They might remember grandparents speaking Arabic in the home, or the rhythm of old prayers once said under breath. They might recall dishes flavored with saffron and mint, or weddings that followed patterns no longer fully explained. These fragments lived inside families quietly, sometimes unconsciously, sometimes intentionally preserved. The emotional landscape of hidden practices. Imagine a Morisco grandmother rising at dawn. While grinding grain for the morning meal, she faces the eastern window out of habit, murmuring a short blessing she barely remembers. This is not an act of rebellion. It is an act of longing, of holding onto something that makes her feel connected to her ancestors. She hopes no neighbor sees, not because she fears harsh punishment, but because she does not want misunderstanding or gossip. Or imagine a converso mother instructing her daughter to wash linens before Passover. Not because the family still celebrates it, but because cleanliness pleases God. Her daughter doesn't know the origin of the tradition. She only knows it makes her mother feel peaceful. These quiet practices were not acts of defiance. They were acts of identity, carried gently and privately in homes. In many cases, they became less theological and more cultural, a form of comfort or nostalgia that persisted long after families had sincerely embraced Christianity. Sincerity and complexity. Most conversos and moriscos were genuine Christians. One of the greatest misconceptions about this era is the assumption that conversos and moriscos lived double lives. Some did, yes. But the majority did not. The majority were sincerely Christian, having lived within Christian society for decades or centuries. Their baptismal faith was not a mask. It was their genuine spiritual home. Yet identity is not binary. It is layered. A person may embrace a new faith sincerely, while still carrying affection for old customs, respect for ancestors, nostalgia for childhood rituals, fear of losing family heritage, or confusion about how much to reveal. These layers created emotional complexity, but not always conflict. For many, Christianity provided meaning, community, and comfort. Their hidden practices were not expressions of theological difference. They were expressions of cultural continuity. The same way people today may cherish foods, songs, or sayings passed down through generations even after the original cultural context has faded. The role of community suspicion. Suspicion, when it existed, was often motivated more by social tensions than theological ones. Envy might spark rumors. Economic rivalry might fuel accusations. Old grudges might reappear in new forms. A wealthy converso merchant could draw resentment. A morisco farmer's agricultural skill could provoke jealousy. These social dynamics were more influential than doctrinal disagreements in shaping how communities viewed one another. Most Spaniards were not scanning their neighbors for heresy. They were tending fields, raising children, and praying sincerely. But human jealousy can turn theological tools into social weapons. And so some families lived quietly, not because they feared the Inquisition itself, but because they feared neighborly misunderstanding that might reach inquisitorial ears. The weight of old stories. Stories of past trials lingered like shadows, even in towns where no inquisitor had set foot for decades. Families passed down warnings. Do not speak too openly. Lighting the candles may draw attention. Old customs are beautiful, but not worth trouble. These stories became part of the emotional inheritance, shaping behavior long after the original reasons had faded. Sometimes the fear was exaggerated. Sometimes it was misplaced. Sometimes it was protective. And sometimes it was simply the echo of trauma carried down through generations. The gentle pull of assimilation. By the late 1500s and early 1600s, the cultural landscape had shifted. With each new generation, more customs faded. More children identified seamlessly with Christianity. More families felt fully part of Spanish culture. Assimilation was not forced in most cases. It was gradual, organic, and often welcomed. Conversos became scholars, clergy, soldiers, merchants, and officials. Moriscos became farmers, craftsmen, musicians, and artisans. Yet even as assimilation grew, the emotional undercurrents remained. A Morisco might still cherish a lullaby passed down from a great-grandmother. A converso might still cook a traditional meal on a certain holiday without knowing why. Identity is a palimpsest, layers written atop older layers, never fully erasing what came before. Love, family, and the desire for safety. Above all, what shaped the inner lives of conversos and moriscos was love. Love for their children, whom they wished to protect. Love for their ancestors, whom they wished to honor. Love for God, however they understood him. Love for the sense of belonging that Christian society offered. Love for the memories that shaped their families. These emotional forces often outweighed fear. A converso mother lighting quiet candles was not thinking of theology or law. She was thinking of her mother, and her mother's mother, stretching back across time. A Morisco father whispering a traditional blessing over a newborn was not rejecting Christianity. He was welcoming his child into the world as he had been welcomed. These moments were tender, human, and deeply personal. The Inquisition's role, more distant than many imagine. It is important to remember that the Inquisition did not monitor homes or seek daily infractions. It operated slowly, deliberatively, bureaucratically, and usually far from rural life. Most conversos and moriscos never encountered an inquisitor at all. Their anxiety came not from the institution itself, but from the possibility of being misunderstood by neighbors or local clergy. In truth, inquisitors were often more patient, procedural, and cautious than popular stories suggest. But perception rarely mirrors reality. And in the emotional life of a family, perception mattered more than legal procedure. The quiet beauty of persistence. In the end, what remains most striking about the inner lives of conversos and moriscos is the quiet dignity with which they navigated their identities. They lived with sincerity, caution, hope, cultural memory, devotion, and the universal human desire to belong. Their hidden practices, when they existed, were often small, symbolic, and heartfelt. They remind us that identity is not enforced or erased overnight. It is shaped gently, slowly, through centuries of lived experience. Tonight, as we reflect on their journeys, we honor the subtle emotional world they inhabited, a world rich with nuance, longing, and resilience. Soft transition to Part 20. In Part 20, we will draw the entire series to a peaceful close, reflecting on how the Spanish Inquisition ultimately shaped the emotional fabric of Spain, not just through institutions and policies, but through memories, stories, and the quiet resilience of ordinary people. Part 20. The lingering echo, how memory, myth, and time softened the shadows of the Inquisition. As we arrive at Part 20, imagine the softest possible transition. A warm Iberian dusk settling over the tiled rooftops of an old Spanish town. Swallows dip in gentle arcs across a fading apricot sky. Wooden window shutters creak open to welcome the evening breeze. The air smells faintly of rosemary and distant sea spray. Everything feels calm, slow, untouched by the softness of history settling into memory. This final chapter is not about fear, trials, or authority. It is about what remains after centuries of lived experience. Decisions, doubts, hopes, faith, misunderstandings, resilience, and quiet endurance. What lingered was not only the institution of the Spanish Inquisition, but also the echo of its presence. Over generations, that echo softened and reshaped itself, becoming less a shadow of terror and more a collection of stories, interpretations, and cultural memories passed from parent to child. Tonight, we wander gently through that landscape of memory. We explore how ordinary Spaniards, long after the last tribunal adjourned, made sense of the era in ways that softened the edges, humanized the past, and allowed their families and communities to move forward. This is not the story of the Inquisition as an institution. This is the story of how people remembered it. The slow fading of an institution. The Spanish Inquisition did not end in a single dramatic moment. Its authority faded gradually, like a shoreline slowly reshaped by the tide. By the 1700s, it was a far quieter institution. Fewer trials. More paperwork than prosecutions. Long stretches of inactivity. A growing sense that its role had become symbolic. Europe was changing. Spain was changing. The ideas of the Enlightenment drifted slowly across the continent, bringing new conversations about reason, tolerance, and the limits of authority. Even those who disagreed with these new ideas felt their influence. By the early 1800s, the Inquisition felt like an artifact of an older world. When it was officially abolished in 1834, many Spaniards recognized the historical significance, but emotionally, the transition was gentle. Something that had already grown quiet was simply put to rest. The imprint remained, but the institution no longer cast the long shadow it once had. The transformation of stories across generations. For families whose ancestors experienced trials, investigations, or mere suspicion, the generational retelling softened the edges over time. A frightening experience might turn into a cautionary anecdote. A tense moment might become an exaggerated family legend. What was once whispered with fear might later be recounted with humor. Your great-grandfather hid the wrong book and confessed to a mistake he didn't even make. Or, your great-great-aunt lit candles on Friday evenings and insisted it was because the kitchen smelled better in low light. In this way, memory transformed trauma into narrative, and narrative into identity. For most families, the Inquisition became a backdrop rather than a lived threat. It was part of the texture of their world, not the defining force of their lives. Myth, mistaken memory, and romanticized history. As the generations passed, the emotional memory of the Inquisition intertwined with myth and misconception. Some people imagined it as omnipresent, though it rarely was. Others pictured inquisitors patrolling the streets, though in reality, they operated through slow, formal bureaucratic processes. The imagination filled gaps where experience had faded. Literature in later centuries often portrayed the Inquisition with dramatic tension, dark cloaks, secret chambers, ominous ceremonies. These images lingered more strongly than the quieter reality of case files, clerks, long pauses between reports, legal technicalities, correspondence between distant offices. The dramatic vision overshadowed the mundane truth. Yet in many ways, this dramatic reimagining helped Spain process its past. It allowed fear to be externalized, exaggerated, and finally released through storytelling. The quiet integration of conversos and moriscos into Spanish identity. After hundreds of years of cultural blending, intermarriage, shared neighborhoods, and joint participation in community life, Spain's population gradually wove itself into a single cultural fabric. By the 1700s, many families with Jewish or Muslim ancestry no longer knew their exact origins. They knew only that their grandmother had a beautiful way of braiding bread. Their uncle sang melodies that no one else's family knew. Their mother cooked with spices that felt ancient. Their father prayed with a certain rhythm. These were cultural gifts, not marks of suspicion. In time, the differences that had once invited scrutiny became threads woven into the larger tapestry of Spain's identity. Identity healed itself through silence, memory, and shared life. How Spain remembered itself after the Inquisition. As Spain entered the 19th and 20th centuries, public memory of the Inquisition became more historical than emotional. Scholars debated it. Writers dramatized it. Tourists asked about it. But for most Spaniards, its emotional weight was no longer personal. Instead, the memory became a symbol of old authority, a subject for reflection, a reminder of the importance of tolerance. Even devout Spanish Catholics came to view the era with nuance. The Church's role was examined, sometimes defended, sometimes critiqued, but always situated within the broader context of centuries of complex history. What remained was not fear. What remained was thoughtful reflection. Stories of resistance turned into legends. Some families passed down heroic stories of ancestors who defied pressure or protected their neighbors. Whether entirely factual or embellished with time, these stories reflected a longing to remember the past with dignity. A Morisco ancestor who sang quietly in Arabic before sleep. A converso great-grandmother who insisted on lighting a candle at dusk because it comforted her. A priest who protected a family from false accusations. A neighbor who testified truthfully and saved a life. These memories, factual or not, softened the era's harshness. They became the emotional counterbalance to fear, a reminder that even in tense times, kindness and loyalty persisted. The softening of silence. One of the most striking aspects of post-Inquisition life was the quietness that settled over Spain regarding the era. This silence was not repression. It was practicality, fatigue, and the natural healing of time. Generations born long after the final trials knew of the Inquisition as something distant, like a storm that had passed centuries earlier. They recognized its gravity, but not its immediacy. Their concerns were different. Harvests. Political changes. The complexities of modernization. Family life. Migration. Wars and peace. The Inquisition, once a living part of daily anxiety, became little more than a chapter in long history books. A legacy of reflection rather than fear. Today, when people look back on the Spanish Inquisition, they often do so with curiosity rather than dread. It inspires questions about human nature, authority, identity, and tolerance. But its emotional weight no longer presses on daily life. If anything, it has become a reminder of the importance of compassion, the necessity of understanding others, the dangers of suspicion, the value of cultural memory, the resilience of communities, the quiet dignity of ordinary people. What remains strongest is not the fear of the event, but the human stories that survived it. Closing the circle, a gentle farewell. As we close this 20-part journey, picture once more that warm Spanish courtyard at dusk. The stars have grown brighter. the fountain continues its gentle trickle. A worn stone wall glows faintly in moonlight. Time itself feels softened, mellowed, and peaceful. History is often loud when it happens, and quiet when it settles. The Spanish Inquisition, so dramatic in popular imagination, ultimately dissolved into memory, leaving behind not terror but contemplation. And so we leave it here, not as a looming presence, but as a chapter gently closed. As we come to the end of this long, quiet journey through one of history's most complex and often misunderstood eras, allow yourself to exhale and let the weight of the story drift away. The centuries we traveled together were filled with shadows and light, with fear and resilience, with ordinary people navigating extraordinary pressures. Yet as time passed, the echoes softened, and the world moved forward, carrying only memory in its hands. Tonight, let that softened memory settle gently around you, like candlelight fading in a quiet room. Thank you for listening, for learning, and for resting with this story. Background Historian out.